I declare open the public hang on. You guys right? Yeah. I declare open the public hearing of the Joint Committee of the Public Accounts and Audit for the inquiry into the effectiveness of Australia's National Anti-Doping Scheme, and I thank the witnesses for being here today. Welcome everyone, and to the ANAO. I call representatives from Sport Integrity Australia, the Department of Infrastructure, Transport, Regional Development, Communications, Sport and the Arts, and the Australian National Audit Office. For the Hansard record, could you please state your name and the capacity in which you appear before the committee, and we'll start on my right.
Hi, Chris Butler, Head of Anti-Doping Operations for Sport Integrity Australia.
Welcome.
Luke McCann, Deputy CEO, Strategy, International Policy and Corporate for Sport Integrity Australia.
And Sarah Benson, CEO, Sport Integrity Australia. Good morning.
Morning.
David McKay, Deputy Secretary, Department of Infrastructure, Transport, Regional Development, Communications, Sport and the Arts.
Travis Haslam, First Assistant Secretary, Office of Sport within the same department.
Christine Chalmers, Executive Director, Performance Audit Services Group at the ANAO.
So Rona Mellor, Deputy Auditor General, appearing today as Acting Auditor General.
And Peter Lane, Group Executive Director, Performance Audit Services Group, ANAO.
Welcome everyone. Fantastic titles. This hearing is a formal proceeding of the Parliament. Giving of false and misleading evidence is a serious matter and may be regarded as a contempt of the Parliament. The evidence given today will be recorded by Hansard and attracts parliamentary privilege. I remind all present that as Chair I will ensure that the proceedings are conducted in an orderly, respectful and courteous way. I further remind committee members that public officials should not be asked to give opinions on matters of policy and should be given a reasonable opportunity to refer questions to superior officers or to a minister. However, this does not preclude questions asking for explanations of policies, factual questions about when and how policies were adopted. Witnesses are also reminded that any claim would be contrary to the public interest to answer a question must be made by a minister and accompanied by a statement setting out the basis for the claim. Now, I understand that the ANAO have already submitted an opening statement which we will just pop into Hansard, so thank you for that. But maybe if I offer Sport Integrity Australia the chance to make an opening statement and then we can open it up for a discussion, if that's all right. Yep.
Thank you. Thank you, Chair, Deputy Chair and Committee for the opportunity to provide an opening statement and to address the committee today. Sport Integrity Australia was established just over 5 years ago as a national agency dedicated to safeguarding the integrity of sport in Australia. The agency consolidated multiple integrity functions under one roof to provide a coordinated, proactive and comprehensive approach to threats facing sport. The role of SIA as an independent statutory agency is to prevent and address threats to sport integrity and coordinate a national approach with a view to achieving fair and honest sporting performance and outcomes, promoting positive conduct on and off the sporting arena, achieving a safe, fair and inclusive sporting environment at all levels, and enhancing the reputation and standing of sport in Australia. Integrity threats are broad. They include doping, competition manipulation and abuse of young people and other members in sport. Actions that seek to educate and empower, deter and prevent, and detect and enforce are important to maximise our impact in both preventing and addressing threats to sport integrity. As Australia's national anti-doping organisation, and in line with our obligations under the World Anti-Doping Code and the Sport Integrity Australia Act, we deliver a comprehensive anti-doping program through Australia's National Anti-Doping Scheme to protect the health of Australian athletes and the integrity of sport. As an Australian government agency, we comply with the requirements and obligations under relevant Commonwealth frameworks to ensure performance, accountability, transparency, and therefore trust in what we do. We also fulfil the Australian Government's international commitments, including implementing the World Anti-Doping Code in Australia and our commitments to the Council of Europe Anti-Doping Convention and the UNESCO International Convention Against Doping in Sport. And this ensures that Australia can compete at international events. Australia's sporting culture is deeply embedded in our national identity. And with the 2032 Brisbane Olympic and Paralympics on the horizon, ensuring integrity frameworks are robust, fair and accountable both in Australia and on the world stage is more important than ever. Sport Integrity Australia welcomes this inquiry by the committee. The ANAO performance audit finalised earlier this year found that SIA's arrangements for preventing and detecting doping are largely effective for sports that have government-funded testing arrangements. SIA has a fit-for-purpose national anti-doping framework, has effective arrangements to prevent anti-doping rule violations, and actions in response to proven violations were appropriate. Overall, the audit found that SIA's management of the National Anti-Doping Scheme is partly effective, informed by observations relating to governance, anti-doping prevention and detection, and also investigations. ANAO made 7 recommendations. We have accepted all 7 and completed actions against 4. Work continues with support of external expertise on Recommendation 1 relating to establishing an effectiveness and efficiency measure due for completion end of this financial year, and Recommendations 6 and 7 relating to investigative procedures and assurance due for completion the first quarter of next year. Since the ANAO audit, SIA has also been subject to a compliance audit by the World Anti-Doping Agency earlier this month. The audit assessed SIA's compliance against all aspects of the World Anti-Doping Code. The audit was conducted on-site over 3 days by international experts by WADA. We are waiting for the final audit report, which will include a number of minor corrective actions. On 23rd of October, I received a formal letter from WADA which stated that SIA has a mature and robust anti-doping program. The audit team noted the quality of SIA's testing program, specifically the comprehensive risk assessment process, which was linked to an effective and proportionate test distribution plan, the agency's strengths in intelligence and investigations, the agency's athlete-centred evidence-based education program, and SIA's well-functioning IT and security infrastructure, protecting the personal and sensitive information that we hold. The positive WADA audit findings are important. They provide assurance to Australian athletes and indeed all our stakeholders that SIA is compliant with the code and that WADA see Australia as a leading nation in the fight against doping in sport. Globally, we have a high standing, and this is demonstrated by our appointments to several WADA committees and ongoing requests to develop capability in the region. Since the audit and in addition to the ANAO recommendations, we have proactively implemented a number of new initiatives, one being a new case management system, which went live just this Monday, allowing for enhanced monitoring of cases, improved timeliness, quality assurance and procedural compliance. In closing, Australian athletes must have confidence that SIA is following the rules and procedures required of us and that their international competitors are subject to the same rules. We want both our domestic and global anti-doping frameworks to serve and protect all that is special about sport in Australia on behalf of the Australian sporting community. SIA is committed to continuous improvement and the pursuit of best practice and recognises the important role both the audit and the inquiry play in this endeavour. So thank you, Chair, and thank you, Committee.
Thank you, Dr Benson. So I might start with the difference between the opt-in and or the user pay system and the government pay system. Can you outline to the committee what the differences are in terms of number of checks, transparency around checks, why we've got 2 systems basically, and how they work?
Yeah, so the SIA has, or Sport Integrity Australia under the National Anti-Doping Scheme, has a requirement to implement a test distribution plan, but it might take one step back. For sporting organisations in Australia to be recognised as a national sporting organisation, they enter agreement with the Australian Sports Commission, and part of that agreement requires sporting agencies or national sporting organisations to adopt a number of policies and education plans before they can be deemed compliant and recognised. Part of our role is assessing sports anti-doping policies and education programs to make sure that they are WADA compliant and meet the international conventions. I'll step down to how this fits. So once those are deemed compliant by us, we then work with sports to implement their policies, and part of that is working with sports to implement their anti-doping testing program. Now, we have two funding streams, so not all sports can afford to fund their own testing programs. We expect that professional codes and major codes can afford to fund their own anti-doping programs. So we essentially have two streams in which we fund our anti-doping program. One is government funded and the other is user pays. Both are in line with the WADA international standard with respect to planning tests, whether or not it's government funded or user pays, and they step down from the international standard that says we must have a test distribution plan which determines number of tests across sports and disciplines, but that plan must be risk informed, and that risk assessment informs how tests are distributed across within government funded, but also work with sports to determine their plan for their test for the year.
So let's break it down a little bit, and thank you for that answer. So you've got the user pay system. Which codes are involved in that?
Yep, so it will be, and I'll just pull out my notes, AFL, Australian football, actually I'll just find them. So AFL, NRL, Basketball Australia, National Basketball League, Cricket Australia, Football Australia and Rugby Australia.
Okay, so they're obviously the major sporting codes. So what, if you're a user pay, do you get to choose when players are tested?
No. A number of factors inform how we establish that test distribution plan. It is recognised as best practice that us as a regulator work with sports. They know their doping environment the best. They're on the ground and they know what the landscape looks like. But there's a number of inputs that inform that risk assessment. So ultimately, whilst we might be conversing and engaging with sports to understand the landscape, the nature of their competitions and timing of competitions, that is just one input into that risk assessment. The ultimate decision on who is tested and when is determined by Sport Integrity Australia, incorporated into the plan and executed and implemented by Sport Integrity Australia. And
what visibility do the sporting codes get if you make a decision to test an athlete?
My understanding, and I might pass to Chris Butler, they've not got a heads up or awareness of who is being tested when. And I might just pass to
that's
Chris.
correct. That the sports under a user pay arrangement have no visibility of who we choose to test and when. It's entirely CIA's decision.
So you turn up to a training session and just test someone? Is that how does it work?
Yeah. Yep. Yes.
Yeah. Entirely. So it's entirely unannounced. That the testing we sort of split into two categories really, which is out of competition, any time at training or off season, or in competition at the events. And so we don't give any advance notice. A team of SIA testers will turn up at a training venue, an athlete's home, or a competition as such, and we expect that the facilities will be available. So, for example, we need facilities to conduct testing, but we don't inform a sport, the AFL, please set us up a room on round 2 against Geelong, because that would obviously be giving some notice we're coming. So entirely our decision, can happen anywhere, any place, but obviously training and competitions are the two main places that testing would occur.
And so what are the numbers in terms of testing the user pay system versus the government pay system? Is there any discrepancy between the numbers?
They'll vary across each individual sport based on the risk and discipline. The breakdown for 2023 to 2024, as provided and I think reflected in the ANAO audit report, the fully funded samples, so the government-funded samples, were 3,366 and the user pay samples were 3,165. But they will vary across different sports and are informed by risk. And they'll vary year on year as well as we undertake that risk assessment to inform the plan and then implement the plan.
I have a question.
Please, yeah. And then go.
For me, the user pay system is completely undermined by the lack of a conflict of interest register being properly maintained and the proper declaration from what we've seen in the AO report of offers, gifts. So for me, you may have a user pay system that you say is robust, you're not given any heads up, but then if at the same time somebody's, for example, accepting an offer to attend one of these sporting codes and they're sitting next to or they're interacting with, you know, the major players in that sporting code, and you don't have a proper register of those risks, that completely undermines everything that you say about the integrity of a user pay system. What do you say about that?
Yeah, no, I appreciate that, and you're spot on. From our perspective, I'll provide a high-level response and then pass to Luke McCann, but our starting position is we don't accept those offers of attending sporting events and functions. There may have been, before my time, an occurrence of one or two attendants for a specific reason which was documented, but whenever we get those offers of AFL Grand Final or whatever it might be, they're politely declined. Whilst we see the value, we politely decline them. The issue that we had at the time of the audit, and it was helpful to identify given the significance of it, was we weren't recording those offers and then declining the declining of those offers. So therefore there wasn't a record or transparency, I guess, with respect to that. That has now changed, thank you, and we're also taking the next step to automate that process as well. Well, not automate, but have an online form to make sure that we can track, trace and assure ourselves that we are actually being consistent across the agency with respect to that position.
Mm-hmm. On that, I might just jump to the ANAO. There was 22 instances where, was it the former CEO had been invited? So I need to go ask the department. Oh, I think that it's okay. There was no. I don't think there was no opening statement. Yeah. Sorry. The ANAO found 22 instances where there were tickets being offered but not declared. Was it to the former CEO? Is that the ANAO's understanding?
So in the audit report at paragraph 242, we go through some things that were noticed through the course of the audit. We didn't systematically examine every email for this issue. So this was almost an incidental thing through the process of examining a non-exhaustive set of emails, that we did see offers that had been made to the former CEO of hospitality. So yes, that was 22 invitations to sporting or sporting-related events from World Athletics, the Australian Olympic Committee, ACT Brumbies, Football Australia, and the Australian Rugby League Commission. What we didn't see was so none of those offers were documented. We don't know whether the offers were accepted or declined because there were no records around that. We do know that there were some invitations declined because the reason given was because the CEO was unavailable to attend the events. But that was we could only see records for 2 of the 22 in relation to that. And then we also saw as well that there were some offers through this non-exhaustive examination of emails, were some offers to other officials within SIA, which were accepted and were not declared.
If I can just add,
yep.
Mr Burns, I think when we audit regulatory agencies, one of the things we are looking for is evidence that in the governance framework that there is attention to regulatory capture, which is where I think your colleague has gone. And I'm not suggesting it's easy in terms of the nature of the regulation. When you look at ASIC, the rule base is very strong about what can be done and what can't be done. What we saw here wasn't clean. Non-exhaustive means we didn't audit, we didn't scrape the systems, we didn't look for more evidence. What there may be, and there may be declines as well. We saw what we saw. It's a risk area for regulators that they have a culture and a posture that's clearly pushed into the organisation all the time, that the way they deal with the regulated agencies is managed, rules-based and transparent.
Yeah.
And it wasn't that good here.
So Dr Benson, just going back to something you said before, that no gifts or no offers were accepted,
Since my time as CEO, my understanding prior to that time, and I thought it was captured in the report, but we'll have to double check. I thought that we'd said there was only one offer of attending, and I'm sure it wasn't the CEO, but we'll have to double check an event, and all of those listed were not accepted. But that is something that we will formally follow up if that's of help.
In the Auditor General's report of 2.41, as of May 2024, the quarterly public disclosures showed the acceptance of 3 gifts or benefits received between 1 January 2020 and 31 March 2024, with the highest value gift at $5,400. A 2020 gift to the CEO of Qantas Chairman's Lounge membership was first disclosed in January 2024 and valued at $0. Was that your understanding too?
Yes, sorry, that is accurate. When I was thinking of and referring to around 1, it was the attendance at major events, not more broadly at the gifts. I was just referring to the 22 offers of attending major events. But I might pass to Luke just to talk about what we have done since. But I absolutely agree with you and recognise that it is an area that we need to strengthen and evolve, and we've taken some steps and there's more to come, but certainly accept that
before we go to
perception.
Mr McCann, I mean, why would Sports Integrity Australia accept any gifts from any sporting organisation?
Yeah, well, again, I might pass to Luke.
So the example that is quoted as accepting what we call sport hospitality was accompanying the Minister to a basketball match at the World Basketball Championships on the back of the Global Education Conference that was run by WADA. One of the officials that went from our organisation was not in an operational position. So not in a position to make any decisions around doping or testing.
But if Sport Integrity Australia needs to accompany the Minister, which is entirely appropriate, why doesn't Sport Integrity Australia just fund that?
Well, both Sarah and I weren't in the organisation at the time. I guess the question would be, at that point, there was a number of WADA officials or other officials going to that meeting. It was part of a broader global event that we hosted with people from all over the world. The offer was there for them, and I think in that point it was decided that it was appropriate that someone from our organisation attend in company with the Minister. As I said, it wasn't anyone in an operational capacity. I think I would also add that up until the audit, the general practice in our organisation was we do not attend sporting events. We acknowledge that it wasn't documented, and we have documented that now, and the process that we've put in place is an online tool where if you receive the offer of a gift, it goes into a register, is then noted and approved.
But why does Sport Integrity Australia need to have any gift arrangement with any of the major sporting events, given they have a system that separates them from other sporting codes?
Well, I would say that we need a process in place because we get unsolicited offers to attend events.
But then why isn't the policy just we don't accept it?
Well, it is. The general practice is we do not accept gifts and benefits, but in some instances we have, and we document it, and we document the reasons why.
So what would be the reasons why Sport Integrity Australia would?
Sorry.
I might just jump in with one recent example post the audit. We present and get invited to present at different integrity forums. One integrity forum we have presented at is the AFL Integrity Forum, which looks more broadly at protection, security, but also uplifting integrity across the AFL. Luke recently presented at that forum, and as a presenter he was offered a gift to the value of, it was under $150 roughly, but I'll have to confirm, and it was an AFL ball. Now, that's going through the process. At the time, it wasn't handed back in front of everyone, so now it will go on formal display in the office with other things. So that's the nature of the gift. The other ones that have occurred are similar things where somebody might have presented at a forum on integrity, been given a box of chocolates or something. We'll put that into the social club and then auction it off to raise money for the social club. But still take the point. I mean, absolutely.
There is a difference between a $5,400 gift and, a Sharon by saying thanks to, for speaking at something. Obviously, I understand that. I guess has there been any communication between Sport Integrity Australia and the major sporting codes to say, as much as we like the Sharons for speaking at your conference, it's just better that we don't accept any gifts? Has there been any communication like that to any of the codes?
No, not formally like that, but that might be an opportunity if you see fit.
As I said, it's a difficult area. The nature of the business, regulators do need to have relationships with stakeholders. Meetings are good with note takers. There is something behind what you're saying, Chair, about communicating into stakeholder groups, no matter what the regulation field, about the tone that you want to bring to the relationship and documenting that you don't invite gifts. And it can change behaviour. Certainly what we see in some large procurements, for example, is that communicated very formally. Certainly for auditors, we're very formal about communicating the lack of sort of hospitality engagement, and it is something that we would encourage entities, particularly regulators, to think about, is to set the tone of that engagement and document it, and they tend to drop away in terms of putting the risk in your court rather than in their own.
Yeah. There's many more questions, but I'm going to hand over the Deputy Chair and then we'll go around to the other members as well.
Thank you. I'll just stick to this theme of the conflicts. I note on page 36 of the report on paragraph 237, the ANO found that none of 8 SES officials completed an annual declaration form. Can you talk us through, firstly, what is the annual declaration, and then why was that allowed to occur, and what steps have you taken to make sure that doesn't happen?
Yep, I'll jump in and then I'll pass to Luke. My understanding, and I fell in this bucket when I joined the agency in 2023, the policy at the time stated that if there was no real perceived conflict, then there was not a requirement to fill out the form and to declare. That meant that the SES did not have those forms in place, so I certainly didn't. That has since changed. The policy has been updated to reflect the requirement to complete that regardless annually, and that goes through the new system that is an online form that is assessed and ensures that risk mitigation strategies are in place and reviewed regularly. And that process is now annually. We now monitor trends as well, thanks to the recommendation. Monitored any trends or hotspots we might have in the agency where there are conflicts or perceived conflicts, where we might need to increase education or update the procedure. So the audit did certainly shine a light on enhancing our documented processes, but also trying to go one step further to make sure we've got some insights into what we've got going on in the agency with respect to potential conflicts.
Was the CEO at the time aware that these conflicts were not being, these declarations were not being filled out?
I'm not sure. I can't talk on behalf of the previous CEO, so I'm not sure. But that's something we
but
can
now,
follow up if it's
now that the steps you've put in place, you would be aware?
I'm aware, yes.
Yeah. Okay. On page 36, 2.38, it says that 4 out of 21 officials examined, all SCS officials engaged by SEA as of 1st of July 2024 that declared conflicts of interest relating to outside employment of a conflict of interest disclosure form. Can SEA confirm its outside employment policy now?
Yeah, I might pass to Luke on that one. Yep.
In terms of managing conflicts of interest, what we do is we get people, all staff, to lodge a conflict of interest declaration, and we encourage over-compliance. So if you're in doubt, you declare. That is then pushed through a process of approval right through to, if there's no declaration of conflict, an SCS officer will approve that declaration. If there is, it goes to a management action plan, which would be, can that conflict be managed? So what I mean by that is, if you are declaring that you are coaching your child's under-8 cricket team and you're working in a corporate area, we would say that that is something that can be managed because your area doesn't have anything to do with anti-doping. If it was an official that had work in, say, a high-level or high-performance area of the NRL and they worked in doping, then that might be an issue and we would have to manage that. So we would generally, in that instance, have to ask someone to step down from that particular position. So when we say outside employment, by and large, what that means is anyone who's volunteering in a sport. So those decisions are then made by either myself.
Oh, so even a volunteer job you'd consider?
Correct.
Right.
We capture everything that involves people that are working in and around sport.
Okay. So with these 4 particular instances, of course not asking you to reveal who those 4 people were, but what was the nature of their outside employment?
I don't have the specific nature of the employment, but they're not, certainly wouldn't be paid positions. They'd be people volunteering in a capacity in a club.
You
Okay.
can follow that up.
Yep.
Just so you've got that information.
Yeah, if you can confirm that they weren't paid positions. And so is it possible to, do your rules allow for people to take other paid positions?
No. We wouldn't allow someone to take a paid position in a sport or associated entity, no.
So even if it's not related to the nature of your work, like working for a sponsor of a club or something like that, it's strictly prohibited.
Yeah.
Might just double check that because I think we'll confirm that because there are, unrelated to sport, some potential roles where people may be paid.
In what way?
I'm trying to think of the example, but I don't have it at hand. But I just don't want to say definitively no when I think that's just something I would like to clarify. And perhaps we can clarify that in the background so that we've got the answer for you. Just check our policy and recent approvals.
I want to go to a different topic. In relation to the test distribution plan, page 93, it says that during the course of the audit, the ANAO observed that in March 2024, SEA developing the test distribution plan. Can I confirm that SEA did not have a formal procedure for test distribution prior to March 2024?
I might just pass to Luke, to Chris to jump in there with respect to that, and that relates to recommendation 4, I think, just to clarify. Yes. So, I mean, I might just jump in. I'll pass to Chris. So, we do evaluate our test distribution plan yearly for government and user pays, but at the time of the audit, there was no clearly identifiable documented procedure. So, whilst what we have done, I guess, since the audit is our evaluation methodology and the documented procedure has now been included as part of our procedure. So what we were doing in practice is now recorded in the procedure and that is now evaluated as well. And that is, again, in line with the WADA international standard that dictates what we need to do with respect to that. And that is reviewed. The test distribution plan is reviewed at least quarterly with respect to effectiveness. So we've implemented those review points as well, and that is documented in the procedure. So that's come into play as well. And those that are reviewing the effectiveness at that quarterly point and annually have been given clear guidelines on what they need to be looking at, what data they need to be looking at to test effectiveness.
So if you didn't have a plan before March 2024, was it an ad hoc arrangement? How did you...
Yeah, I might just pass to Chris
you go
to give
about
the clarity on that. Yeah.
the plan, testing and distribution?
Yep. Some further clarity, I guess, is that test distribution plan is something required by the World Anti-Doping Agency. So, and I've worked in SIA and SIA's predecessors for quite a while, and certainly we have had plans, multiple of them, and procedures for developing a test distribution plan for a very long time. I think the ANAO recommendations in particular, the recommendation related to how we documented the involvement of user pay sports in that plan. So it's a requirement for SIA to have a test distribution plan. It has been for a long time under the World Anti-Doping Code. We've had those procedures in one form or another. I'd have to review this one, whether it might relate to the update and a new introduction of the plan that we might have done.
So in documenting a plan, did the procedures and the work change following the implementation of the plan, or was it just simply documenting it and just putting it onto paper and actually having it more formalised?
I would say that our TDP plans and procedures change very regularly, in fact, because they respond to the environment that we're in. So there's a requirement to... The test distribution plan is, I guess, and the procedure that sits behind it is documenting how we will allocate our set sort of resources and across which sports and in which environments. So the way in which we do that responds to the intelligence that we have, responds to directions that we might have from the World Anti-Doping Agency, and is something that naturally should evolve. If we have a procedure that doesn't change based on the environment, then we're probably not responding accurately.
The documenting can get in the way of the thinking here. What we're seeing in the audit, and I accept your testimony about what you've done since, what we're seeing is that when you don't have planning documentation, part of your responsibility is also to evaluate. And so the cycle of you've got the intelligence, you've got the plan that reflects the intelligence, and the cycle then is to step back at the end and say, did we hit the mark? How does that how does that influence the next plan? And I think I'd be disappointed if we've presented a report that says just write documents. The report goes to the risk assessment process by using documents. The absence of documentation actually undermines the risk assessment process, which is quite cyclical for most regulators, and your own, even in the wider framework, is that. So I just wanted to sort of make sure that we weren't getting caught up in, we do documents now, to we do documents and we use them for the purpose of addressing risk and evaluating risk in each cycle.
Thank you. Onto a related but different point, can I go to the anti-doping investigations on page 10, paragraph 22? SIA established an investigations manual in 2020, which as of 2024 had not been updated to align with the Australian Government Investigations Standard 2022. Why has SIA failed to update its investigations manual to align with the Australian Government Investigations Standard 2022?
Thank you. Yeah, and another good observation and recommendation. As you've referenced in the question, the capability uplift in the investigation team has been ongoing for some time, and at the time of the audit, the practices that were in play and used across the agency, again, and without documenting procedures getting in the way of thought and improvement, were not, the documented procedures weren't reflecting what we're actually doing with the updating and I guess alignment with the Australian Government investigation standards. So we'd taken on board the AGIS standard that came into effect late 2022, and we were refining over time our practices. What we've done since and is to document those practices, but also to do a fresh review or a contemporary review against the standards to make sure that we were actually in alignment, but also drawing on lessons learned, operational reflections, changes in technology and global trends to make sure that what we were doing was reflected in our processes. And then, and I mentioned in the opening statement, reflect them in our case management system as well, so that we can ensure when we're adopting processes and policies, we're compliant with the latest version, so that what we say we're doing is documented, and what's documented is what we're actually saying. So the AGIS requirements that were referenced have been considered in the development of our SOPs. And part of, I think it goes to recommendation 6 with respect to the overarching quality assurance framework that sits over the top of that. That is in development as well. That has been drafted, and I formally wrote to the AFP Commissioner on the 29th of July, or previous Commissioner, seeking advice and assurance, just from a quality standards and practice perspective, to come in and review what we're doing from an investigations and quality assurance perspective. Now that we've finalised, the documents have been updated, are in our electronic system, and we've finalised the draft of the quality assurance framework, it's now time for us to bring the AFP in and review under the banner of the Commonwealth School of Investigations, what we're doing to make sure that it has the right quality assurance framework over the top of it, and that where it needs to comply with AGIS, that it actually is.
Deputy Secretary, can I ask you, was the department aware that the manual had not been updated to align with the Commonwealth standards?
Senator, I'll check with my colleague. No.
Okay. When did you become aware? Just once the audit report was tabled?
I guess that partly goes to the role that the department plays in respect of SEA, which is a separate entity with its own governance arrangements. We don't have visibility of the internal operations of SEA to the extent, for example, of updating of policies or individual areas of activity in that way.
Okay. On page 65, July 2024, SEA provided the ANAO with a self-assessment of its compliance against AGIS 2022 requirements. SEA assessed that it did not have established policies, procedures or templates for one requirement, was unsure how to assess one requirement, and had not assessed the remaining 89 requirements. In 2024 of September 2024, SEA's website stated that its investigations were conducted in accordance with the AGIS 2022. However, as of September 2024, and I'm quoting directly from the report here, SEA had not updated its investigations manual and procedures to align with AGIS 2022. Why did the SEA's website state in September 2024 that its investigations are conducted in accordance with AGIS 2022 requirements when its own self-assessment showed that it was non-compliant?
Yeah, and that's a good point. I think from working through this, the practices that were in place were compliant, but they weren't documented and reflected as compliant. So, but take your point. The information on the website should accurately reflect the status of what is happening in the agency.
And was the department aware of that, Deputy Secretary?
No, Senator.
Happy to share the call, Chair, and come back if we've got the time.
We'll go to Ms. France.
Thank you. Dr. Benson, in your introduction you talked about the WADA assessments and review that were done last year. Did you talk about
the
that?
WADA, yep.
And basically they gave you guys 5 gold stars. well, that was the gist of what you said it in your introduction. I'm just, how do you reconcile then the ANAO report, which talks about risk management not fit for purpose, deficiencies in anti-doping investigation practices? So you've got one international organisation talking about the fact that you're amazing and have 5 gold stars, and then, you know, our ANAO saying that arrangements to investigate and respond to anti-doping rules are only partly effective. Yeah, can you just talk to that? Is there a general lower threshold, or why is there such a discrepancy?
And thank you for the question. So from the ANAO perspective and our compliance perspective there, we're looking at obviously compliance with Commonwealth frameworks and ensuring that performance and accountability and transparency. There were things, as we can see through the recommendations, you know, for example, recommendation 1, where we didn't have and don't have still an efficiency and effectiveness measure to comply with the Commonwealth framework for regulatory agencies with respect to performance frameworks. So we don't have that in place. That is part of the evolution and maturing of the agency. That is not a requirement under the code, so under the World Anti-Doping Code. So there are slightly 2 different dimensions of what is being audited, and hence the disparity, or what looks like a disparity with respect to the outcomes. So with respect to the WADA code and what we've been audited on then, the code sets these harmonised standards across all countries so that our athletes can compete on an equal playing field, and WADA expects and hence conducts their audits to make sure that those rules and regulations are being implemented consistently in accordance with their procedures internationally. So the gold standard is to say that we're complying with the World Code and the international standards. That there are still some recommendations in there that we need to take on board that do cross over and have an intersection with the ANAO audit outcomes, particularly with respect to timeliness. So there are some things that did cross over, but then there were some that sit quite differently because they're assessing slightly different aspects of our performance. Both equally inform where we need to be and both equally inform that pathway of improvement.
In my mind, that kind of indicates a lower threshold, in the sense that you couldn't actually say that, you know, following the ANAO report, that there's gold standard practices here.
Well, it's just a different. So the World Anti-Doping Code is with respect to practices and processes across all aspects of what we're doing. The ANAO audit, whilst assessed our compliance with documented procedures, yeah, it's just vastly different. I might get Chris to jump in just to help explain a little bit.
No, I would only add that in some ways it's a positive reflection on the work that ANAO did for us and some of the recommendations, particularly around documenting of risk assessments and things like that, that the WADA audit comes after that and sees some of that improvement that's been made post the audit. And reflects on the robustness of that risk assessment and test distribution planning component in particular, because that is really their focus, or one of their big focuses, to ensure that it's risk informed and that you've got your test distribution plan right. So to some respect, the steps that we were able to take post the ANAO work have aided that assessment of WADA as well.
Okay. Thank you. Sorry. Yeah, you keep going.
No, I was just going to say the WADA audit also, the ANAO audit also focused on, or their recommendations with respect to the ANAO audit focused on one of the international standards, or relate to one of the international standards. There are a number of others for which we didn't receive any ANAO recommendations. So we're saying, well, from our observation and certainly correct and jump in, is, you know, the areas for improvement and where we need to work on relate predominantly to that one standard, whereas the wider audit looked across all of those standards.
Okay. Second question, just relating to the user pays and the government paid system. The ANAO did took a sampled approach to sports, and I just want your response to, in terms of the testing pools, they found that in the government-funded testing pool, there were 65 athletes in registered pool, 96 in the national pool, and 367 in the domestic pool. And of those sampled sports for the user paid, no athletes in the registered or national pools, and 4 athletes in the domestic testing pool. I just want your commentary on that, or what you think about that.
I might pass to Chris if he's got some comments on that.
The testing pools are a tool we use to sort of either prioritise or proportionate our response. So that higher level registered testing pool that you mentioned with 65, I think, from the report, athletes on it, that's a pool of athletes who are subject to whereabouts requirements under the World Anti-Doping Code. So, for example, they're providing us details of their overnight accommodation, their training venues, but importantly a 60-minute window where we can guarantee that we'll find them for testing. So there's some burdensome requirements on those athletes, and that's why you see a tier down. But the pools are designed so that we can find, locate and test athletes in proportionate response. The user pay sports, as you'll appreciate, have very easy to find locations. We know where they're training. The sports are required to provide us those details as part of the contractual arrangement. So there is no, in terms of our ability to find and locate those athletes, there is no requirement to place an extra burden on those particular participants, because the sports provider, we know where they are, and we have no troubles locating them for testing. So those splits of pools are different levels of requirements placed on athletes right to the top, which is quite a burdensome process.
So that leads into my next question. So we're talking about periods of testing and pools, and obviously, 65 in the registered pool and no athletes in the registered or national pools for user pays. But then you look at the periods of testing and periods of no testing during off-season and pre-season for 2 sports under the user pay model. So basically your previous question said that, your previous answer said that you know where they are, and so you just go to their training sessions or whatever. What actually happens in the off-season?
Yeah, and that was we accept the sort of the helpful note made by ANAO there. So we've since updated to, so one, we can test anybody at any time. We've since updated, and we always could, we've updated the sort of agreements with those sports to ensure they actually do cover the entire 12-month kind of period, and updated some of our planning and veracity around the checking of that to ensure, because the off-season does remain an important time for testing quite clearly, as the report notes, and we would strongly support that.
So have you tested in the off-season since this report?
We have.
Okay, good. I have one last question, and it's just directed at the Deputy Secretary of the Department. Thank you all for coming here today, but thank you. What's your view on the funding models, considering that you are the department that funds the user pays and the government funded, and in response to the ANAO's report? I mean, just looking at the ANAO's report and the fact that we've only just recently had updates, the last probably 6 months or 12 months into the testing during off-season, what's your view on how this is funded and whether there's a big difference between government funded and user pays?
I think I'm limited in what I can say in response to that question. SEA's funding arrangements are set through the federal budget process. They reflect decisions of government as to how to resource the organisation. SEA is operationally independent from the department, as we mentioned before, and I really don't think I'm in a position to offer an opinion on the arrangements that SEA has put in place.
Do you think that government funded, just straight out on the evidence, do you think that the government funded testing is better than the user pay system?
I really don't think I'm in a position to offer an opinion.
Fair enough.
Yeah,
that's all right. Thanks.
Can I come back to the test distribution planning changes, Mr. Butler, that you were outlining? Do you mind just sort of going through how they change?
How they change.
You mentioned before that the test distribution plans, or that they change, and that they change frequently.
Yeah, the test distribution plan is obviously, as we've just talked about budget, we have a budget that is set that will allow us to conduct a certain number of tests across the year. What the test distribution plan does is determine how you might allocate those tests across the 95 odd recognised sports in the country. So, and the ANAO report talks to the risk assessments that lead into that. So what you do is, for instance, this year is the 2026 will be the Winter Olympics in Milano. So those sports that are attending the Winter Olympics may be considered to need more testing in the period leading up to that Games, whereas in 2027, 3 years away from the Winter Olympics, we might not have as much focus on those sorts of events. And likewise with the Commonwealth Games and the Olympics that are coming up. So our approach to which sports we're testing when and how many tests allocated through a test distribution plan will change based on those events that are coming up. So that's one example of how that process might change regularly.
Does it ever change as a result of communication by one of the sporting organisations?
No, the decisions on the TDP, who to test, and the risk assessment are purely Sport Integrity Australia's.
Do the user pay sports get to nominate players or entities that they wish to be tested?
The decision on who tests a sport, or who tests an athlete, sorry, is purely Sport Integrity Australia's.
I didn't ask that.
No, and so that's purely our decision. As context to that, behind every test, so what we've moved away from years ago is random testing. Sport Integrity Australia doesn't want to go out and just randomly select any athlete for testing. It's not intelligence informed, it's not risk informed. So we do quite deliberately receive from any sport, whether they're user pay or government funded, we want to know about their sport, what they understand about the risk environment, as Sarah had.
Hang on, okay. So my question was, do the user pay sports get to nominate players or athletes for testing that they wish to be tested?
No, they cannot provide us a name, and we take that name and test them because they've asked us to.
Can I just
please
interject there? At paragraph 3.73 of the audit, we make the point that the number and types of samples for user pay sports was determined through discussions with NSOs.
Sorry, do you mind speaking up a tiny bit?
Yeah, sorry. Yeah. The number and types of samples for user pay sports was determined through discussions with NSOs in reference to testing costs and risks. For example, the AFL provided a target list of athletes that did not include information on the reason for targeting, and that's different to the process with government-funded sports testing.
So do you want to expand on? So the AFL provided Sport Integrity Australia with a list of targeted players?
Yes, and of the 51 athletes on the target list in the 2023-24 season, Sport Integrity Australia collected samples from 50 of those.
That's a pretty good strike rate. So I'll ask again, Mr. Butler, does the codes get to have nominations of players that you then go and test?
Yeah. I mean, it's the same answer again. The decision of who to test is ours. We regularly receive and would like information from sports because they're aware of the environment that their athletes are operating and playing in. It would be negligent of us to not consider information from sports because they know their environment. So, I mean, it's the same answer. We like to receive information.
But hang on, I'll go to you once, or you can go.
Well, just wanted to just make sure you're giving the correct evidence to the question that was asked, because I think the chair was asking, do sporting clubs or bodies provide a list? And I thought you said that they don't.
No,
I may have misheard
check.
that.
I don't recall saying that. I'm not trying to be evasive to the question at all. Of course we would like to receive information from sports about who they think are athletes at risk in their sport. Yes. Yes.
Okay. But hang on, but then what about the non-user pays? Do they provide the same lists?
We would like the same.
Hang on, no, but do they provide the same lists?
They provide the same. We ask for the same information and intelligence from them. If they have that information,
do they give you the list of names like what the AFL did, the 51 names? Do they give the same sort of list? No is okay if that's the answer.
No, I mean it comes in all sorts of intelligence comes from all sorts of forms.
Okay, it does. So we've got a situation where is the AFL the only sporting code that provides those lists of names that they would like tested, or do other sporting codes do that as well?
I'd have to check. I'd have to check just to give you obviously the right answer with respect to.
So you're not sure if other sporting codes provide lists of names of players to test?
I'm not 100% sure. I'd have to check. I know in there's a range of information that is provided.
I feel like that's a pretty big deal. Like if the NRL is saying to Sport Integrity Australia, these are the players we'd like you to test. Like, I feel like that's not real. Like that would put a big alarm bell around some of those players. It's a big deal, isn't it? Like that's one of the biggest parts of your job.
I think, again, if I can provide some context, if that's possible, the sports, particularly the NRL and AFL, but others have integrity departments, like funded people in an integrity department whose job it is to protect the integrity of their sport, but also have the intelligence and the awareness of the athletes in their environment. So it goes to part of the user pay funding model. We expect that those sports themselves have the capacity to fund that, have the capacity to understand the risk, and the ability to share that with us to inform our testing decisions.
But like, let's also talk about it in real terms. You've got a scenario where large sporting organisations are paying for test arrangements. There are other sporting organisations that don't have that privilege. The organisations that are paying to pay for the testing arrangements are nominating which players to test, and according to the ANAO, they are basically the players that are being tested, even though the decision is Sport Integrity Australia, but really it sounds like the decision is the AFL's, because 50 out of 51 is a pretty good strike rate. Why should a sporting code have the ability to nominate who gets tested and other organisations that are not paying don't get that privilege?
I might jump in there and then pass over to Chris. And I take your point, and perhaps my answer is not going to directly respond, because we do need to clarify whether or not we receive the similar lists from other codes. But that information is just one source of the information that we look at informing that risk assessment. I appreciate that particular year, with the number of athletes tested off that list, I appreciate what that says.
Well, how many players that weren't on that list were tested?
That was 235.
235. So a quarter of all of the players tested were nominated by the AFL.
I think part of the issue here, people keep talking about risk assessments, there wasn't. And so the difficulty in answering the questions is why target certain people even if the code brings them forward. I think that the sorts of improvements that you've talked about, at the time we go in, we can't see any relationship between the selection and the risk. And that's a risk for you, because it brings with it an optic of capture by the user pay sports. And so we sort of go into that 373, 374, that it's the absence of the risk assessment that actually undermines the integrity of the activity. Why were those 50 picked? Why were the 235 picked? What was the scope of the risk that the integrity agency was looking at? It looks like here's a list, we'll pick some more, but no integrated, thoughtful risk assessment process.
And going back to the point previously, and certainly accept that, and that's a helpful way to characterise it, and actually helps. The other aspects, and which were in place but are now documented and have the broader risk assessment, was our own intelligence and intelligence from international agencies, but also the history of the doping in sport. An assessment of the relevant physical requirements or physiological requirements of a particular sport, and a whole range of other aspects inform who is tested. So whilst we work with sports to understand their environment, to inform that risk assessment, or inform the risk assessment that then informs the planning, and acknowledging that it wasn't transparent and well documented or at the time. Those things were in place. So yes, while it looks like it's just codes providing us a name and therefore we go off that, there is a broader framework, and there was a broader framework that was informing those decisions. Those points I just read out, they weren't documented, nor was the broader risk assessment with respect to user pays, which goes to the point, I think, which has been really helpfully highlighted, of where that potential risk then is exposed.
Why what reasons does the AFL give to put those 51 names forward?
I think there's no context
I
provided.
think, as was noted in the ANA report, that particular list and lists have been provided in previous years with information, but as is in the report, there wasn't information documented on that particular list.
But didn't you say, Mr. Butler, that you don't do randomised testing? It would be negligible to just sort of randomly test, and what you're looking for is information from these clubs and intelligence from these clubs or these organisations about their own, where to direct their testing. But that's not really intelligence, that's just names, isn't it?
I mean, be a process behind
the AFL has an integrity
names.
department with intelligence officers.
Sure,
that lead to that.
But we don't have the AFL in front of us. I mean, you guys are the peak body that should be governing their integrity process. I mean, if the AFL were to say, look, we have concerns about these particular players because of these reasons, well, that seems like a logical, transparent way of putting names forward. But what have you done to satisfy yourselves with the reasons behind that list of players?
I think one thing that I've observed in the process since coming in is it's a fine line between providing names and context to names and maintaining privacy and confidentiality behind source or intelligence, essentially, or information sources behind why that name may appear in a list. And that's the balance, and that's why we won't have access to that information. I understand your point. It makes sense.
I guess, but isn't it also the problem, though, that if other codes who aren't paying for this access or aren't paying for the ability to have some input into who gets tested and who doesn't, isn't that the whole problem with an integrity regime? I mean, why would you allow the AFL to give those names and basically go off those things, but then, do you ask for the names from other sporting codes?
We do ask for this same information. Is there anything happening in your integrity landscape? Some may provide it, some may not. So it's not precluding the government-funded sports to provide that list.
Part of the risk is, again, and it's the thinking and the documentation coming together, is the optic that the names that are given are low risk. So it goes both ways. Obviously, you build relationships, every regulator does, and the optic is that you're being fed information potentially that takes you away from where high risk is, as well as the optic that it could take you to high risk. And the absence of rationale for the selection of players or athletes is a risk to you. Which is what we're trying to get to in the report. It's much easier to do verbally than writing
let's
in a
unpack
report.
that a little bit. We've still got a little bit more time. Of the 235 players in the AFL, how many had a sort of adverse finding?
I don't know the answer to that.
No, I don't have the statistics on me, other than there was a media of one AFL player in the last couple of days, but I don't have the exact numbers. It is a low number.
how many of the 50, were any of them in the 50 of the names that they provided, or the 51 names that they provided?
I'd have to follow that.
We'd have to follow it up.
My concern is that there's just a bias lens that should be applied to any, from any regulator. If the person you're regulating provides you a list, for me, just as a person off the street, there's a bias lens on that. And, you know, the weight of that intelligence compared to other forms of intelligence, it just can't be acceptable that it's the same.
What? Go on.
Well, I think the Deputy summed up the concern quite succinctly, that, you know, if not suggesting that this is what has transpired, but it's important for an integrity body to ensure that there is complete transparency in the processes and in how you come to the decisions, because it could be gamed in such a way that, you know, it's set up as a decoy, saying, here, look at these people because they're, you know, they're low risk, and you know, which then takes the limited resources you have to focus on them rather than, you know, the broader. Now, not suggesting that that's what has happened, but it potentially could, and I think it's really essential that you put in place those measures. I've got another line of questions, Chair.
Sure.
But,
I've got one more question on this, and then I'll hand over to you. So, on the 235, right? So you've obviously had a think about who are the players that you'd like to test. Does Sport Integrity Australia have a view about the 51 players that the AFL put forward as part of that? As sort of, do they kind of fit your risk assessment as well?
Don't know the detailed answer.
I mean, we would overlay our lens over that list, yes.
What does that mean?
It means that, so if you refer to our 235, why would you test one of those 235 athletes, for example? What's leading to that? You might look at increased performance, risk of injury. If someone is injured and they're playing the big final in 2 weeks' time, there's a whole range of factors that go to risk. So in receiving that list from the AFL, your question is, do we overlay any of our thinking with that list? And the answer is yes.
So it wasn't a surprise, those 51 names. Or would they have? Like, is there specific criteria as to who? Like, is it sort of a general sort of view of Sport and Integrity of Australia, or is there specific things that you go, no, here's the criteria. Your performance has increased by X amount. Your injury time frame is quicker than expected. Your whatever it is that might be the key indicators. Were those 51 names, did they fit those sorts of criteria?
I mean, for the 51, I'd have to take it on notice whether, for each of those, whether they did or did not. But there's as you say, there's a decision, you've articulated well, the decision-making sort of profile. It doesn't mean that we can't test anybody outside of that. There's just a general guidance, particularly coming down from, and the World Anti-Doping Agency set some of those for us, to say you must take into consideration these types of issues when you're considering who to test. So if the question is, did all 51 of those identically meet that, we would have to go away and take that on notice. But it's a decision-making framework rather than a criteria that they have to cross this threshold before you're tested. Because otherwise you'd have athletes and players who know they don't meet that threshold and have got no fear they're being tested. So does that make sense? It's a guidance rather than a cut criteria.
It comes back to the question of, like, what's in it for the AFL to pay, or the NRL, or basketball. I love all of these codes, right? I watch all of them, but I'm saying, like, what's in it to pay? Why are we giving big sporting organisations the privilege of paying for a testing anti-doping regime when other smaller sporting organisations don't have that? Yeah. And if there are any differences in the way in which those regimes are being conducted, well, doesn't that raise serious questions around whether or not these sporting codes are paying for a different set of testing arrangements?
Yeah. I'm happy to start and throw to Sarah, because I think it's a really good question, and you've used the word regularly about privilege of the sports to pay. I think, and I can't speak for the AFL, but if you ask them whether it's a privilege to pay for the testing, they may have a different view. So my perspective is that every sport has the obligation to protect the integrity of their sport. Anti-doping particularly is a really expensive process. So those sports that are receiving government testing are essentially the sports that don't have income coming in outside of the government. They can't afford to pay for that testing themselves. It's not that someone is getting the extra privilege. It's just that if you look at a small, potentially volunteer-run sport with a very small number of administrators that relies purely on government funding and no extra resource, they don't have the capacity to fund their own anti-doping program. So the government, through SEA, is required to supplement that and provide
then the
that.
Question,
so
though,
the difference between
I'm sorry
the
to
two
interrupt because
systems.
we're running out of time.
Okay.
But then the question is, Mr. Butler, is like why, if there are large sporting codes that are paying, why would they get treated any differently? And at the moment, the AFL are submitting names. Other sporting organisations aren't submitting names. There is a compliance with the names that they are submitting. There isn't a clear explanation as to whether other sporting codes have submitted names. There isn't a clear explanation as to whether there is a set criteria as to whether those names actually meet the thinking behind Sport Integrity Australia, which clearly gives some thought because you've got a larger group of players that you test. I'm not questioning whether or not you're making sensible decisions around who to test. I'm questioning as to whether or not the organisations that are paying are getting something as a result of it.
Can I just jump in and then I'll pass to Chris? Having the professional sports within the World Anti-Doping Framework does ensure that consistency. So whilst they may have an option to go elsewhere and not come to us to oversight the anti-doping program, we see it as a positive. I think the audit has identified that there were some documented and undocumented inconsistencies in practice between that, and that alignment is something that we're working on. And I think that goes to your point, is that there shouldn't be those stark differences between the two.
And I think your point is very valid about the consistency across the two sports. It should be. I would reflect on the reality that the professional sports in particular, who are the ones that we're asking to pay for some of the services, have the capacity potentially to contribute to, through financial means, but also through their intelligence, their other means, to provide further information than a very small kitchen table sport just doesn't have the capacity to. We would accept the information. It should be, to your point, the same across them. There's a different capacity to be involved and provide the information than what some other sports might have, because they have full-time people whose that is their role.
Deputy Chair.
Thank you. I just want to go to a different topic in relation to the Advisory Council. The NAO revealed something I would like them to maybe just explain. Firstly, in relation to Register of Interests, where one member of the Advisory Council was actually a sports wagering senior lobbyist. Can you just expand that a little bit so we understand it?
Yes. So this is covered in Appendix 3 in detail of the report. So for the Advisory Council, there are some requirements around declaration of conflicts, which include that the members disclose interests to the Minister. So in relation to advice to the Minister, recommending reappointments, there were disclosure of private interests for each of the 8 members. We did note that subsequent to that, an annual deed poll, which was required, was not completed by those 8 members. But in relation to your specific question, Senator, in their private interest declaration, 2 members declared interests relating to wagering. One member was a sports wagering sector lobbyist, and the other undertook work for a wagering company. And we also found, just through the course of the audit, that one appointee did not declare their interests relating to Nemesis Consulting, which was a firm engaged by Sport Integrity Australia prior to and following the member's appointment.
So what's SEA's policy on having people having any even tangential link to wagering being part of the advisory group?
Yeah, I'll kick off and pass to Luke. The role and function of the Advisory Council is to provide strategic advice to the CEO, so myself now, and to the Minister, more broadly on the broad range of aspects that the agency looks after across all integrity functions. It's not to the operational functions of the agency. We have, since the ANAO audit, updated the Advisory Council's charter and ensured that all conflicts of interest and declarations are updated. Each goes through, so going to your specific question, each goes through an assessment process to see if those conflicts are able to be managed through a management plan with respect to it. I can't talk to the specific approval of the two that have been arranged because I wasn't part of that approval process. I can understand where you're coming from with respect to that, but I can't talk exactly to the basis for the decision.
To me, it doesn't seem appropriate to have anyone involved in providing you advice that has any even tangential link to wagering, given it's a significant part of sporting culture and outcomes on the sporting field. So what is your policy that does your policy allow for people with wagering?
I'll pass to Luke to talk more broadly on that. Yep.
I think specifically it goes to the role of the Advisory Council. So what we seek from them is advice around, we're actually looking for people with industry expertise to provide advice on certain aspects of policy development. They're not giving us advice or guiding decision making in any form. We have a competition and manipulation and match fixing area. We run the national platform as part of our signatory to the Macklin Convention. So part of the work we do is to understand gambling and to understand the impacts and how the gambling or wagering service providers operate within Australia so that we can provide appropriate responses to gambling threats.
Sorry. If that's the case, why do you have someone giving you advice who is currently involved in the gambling industry?
Well, we work with the gambling industry they provide alerts for us in terms of monitoring threats to gambling or match fixing in Australia. I mean, gambling is legal in Australia, so we work with that industry to help develop policy responses to match fixing, not wagering, so in terms of match fixing. So it would be very difficult for us to...
there is a difference between some obligation that the gambling industry would have to alert you of their concerns around a particular instance of match fixing versus Sport Integrity Australia appointing someone to an advisory committee advising the CEO of Sporting Integrity Australia when they are currently involved and financially benefiting from the wagering industry.
That is a perspective. I think that would be the same as having someone from the NRL or the AFL on the advisory committee. They are making money out of sport and we are regulating sport. So I understand the point, but really what we're trying to do there is understand and get advice from a broad range of people involved in our industry. They don't make decisions. It's very early consultation around particular pieces of work we might be considering doing. So it's not like they're making decisions on specific aspects of our operations in any form.
And I'm just thinking back to the last 3 or 4 meetings where I've been the CEO. The members do, if they have a conflict, real or perceived, do step out of the meeting and declare that at the beginning of the meeting, and that is documented. And we've had instances of that. If there's, depending on the topic or what the strategic advice is that's being sought, they will remove themselves from the room, and that is documented. So
this is an advisory council that has to be agreed to by the minister. Is that correct, Mr. McKay?
They are appointed by the minister, that's correct.
And so was it disclosed to the minister that there were 2 members that had connection to the wagering industry?
I don't know, Senator. The department's not involved in the appointment of the advisory council.
So that comes directly from you, does it? How is the list? How is the advisory council list determined of people that are recommended to be appointed?
My understanding is it's various sources of recommendations from the Minister's office, from ourselves, to create that diversity of the diversity of the council. We then work with and through our policy team to with the Minister's office to have those appointments go through the formal process.
In providing the list of the recommendation to the Minister, was the Minister aware that two of the members were connected to the wagering industry?
I'll have to confirm that to make sure that the paperwork that went up, what should have gone to the Minister at the time, and certainly what happens now and happened in the last few months with the extension of 4 appointments, was the conflicts of interest, which would include those declarations, do go up to the Minister. I'll have to confirm what happened back for those appointments initially.
I might be able to assist a little bit there. So in December 2022, the advice to the Minister did include the disclosure of private interests. So it would have been included in that advice. And just in relation to the point that Dr. Benson was made about recusing themselves from meetings, we did also note in the audit that in terms of the meetings that were held in the period that we examined, so 7 of the 8 meetings, there were disclosures of potential conflicts. However, the minutes did not follow a consistent format with regard to that. And both members with wagering interests were present for several discussions relating to the Australian sports wagering scheme. This was discussed in 6 of 8 meetings. One of those members disclosed their wagering interests at one of those 6 meetings that included discussions on wagering, and the other disclosed their interests at 3 of those 6 meetings. We don't know whether they left the room.
Okay.
Can I just contextualise one point in this? And we audit a lot of boards, a lot of advisory committees, etc. And it is fair that in constructing, whether it's governance boards or advisory councils, that you are looking for expertise in the sector. Otherwise, the public servants get called public servants and they don't know what they're talking about. So having that access to expertise through structures like this, I think the key thing that we're pointing out in the audit is how you manage it when you see interests, and that's something we've suggested could be dusted off a lot more clearly to again avoid the optic that the regulator is captured, that there is very clear and transparent accountability for what the function is. You rightly describe it as advisory. It's an important thing to have that connection to what's happening in the market. But I think what we typically see, whether it's governance boards, advisory committees, stakeholder groups, is this management of interest that could influence the advice. And so really looking for the thoughtfulness in process and an understanding to avoid that being, it all comes to regulatory capture all the time, that you're not captured by a sector or a person, and that influences how you actually administer your regulation.
But there's instances, as you've just told us, which is in your report, that where there were meetings that were held, only a few of them where those declarations were disclosed ahead of that meeting. I mean, maybe it's the case that everyone's known to each other in each time and everyone knows where they're from.
Because everyone then accepts risk.
That's right.
Yeah.
That's right. So what steps have you now taken to ensure, given you've had this report, to ensure that these conflicts are always declared, particularly when you're discussing matters that do directly cut across the interests of individuals?
So as I mentioned, the Advisory Council Charter has been updated since my appointment, and updated conflicts of interest provided, particularly from those that didn't have it in place. I think there was one, and for those that have been reappointed and they've gone through that process, there's greater clarity in the Charter with respect to managing that process. Based on the discussion today, we'll go back, and I think the way it's been articulated has been really helpful. Make sure that the Charter actually does instil those practices so that it is protecting against those potential risks. So that's been helpfully articulated to build on what we've already done.
Just conscious of time, Chair. So the report showed that there were no deed polls completed with the previous group. So since the new council has been established, has there been have the deed polls for the new 7 members occurred?
For the Advisory Council, they're all, yes, up to date.
Okay, so that's, you're now ensuring that that's happening. Is that an annual requirement?
That's my understanding.
Yeah.
Yep.
Okay, and you're now ensuring that that happens each year?
Yes.
Okay. I do have plenty of other questions, which I suppose I'm going to put on notice, Chair. Given the hour.
Yeah, time flies, huh? Well, I think we're going to have to wrap up there. But I do thank Sport Integrity Australia for coming today and for answering our questions. And I thank the Auditor General's Office and the Department for being with us today. If you have taken questions on notice, and I think there was a couple, if we can provide that information back to the Secretariat by Friday 14 November, and if the committee has further questions, we'll be sending them in writing, and then we might have a sort of private discussion about whether we all come back and have another little go at this. We'll see how we go. But otherwise, for now, I really do appreciate it. I know it's been an honest and robust conversation, but I appreciate your answers and your work. And I'll declare this hearing closed. The meeting will now be suspended for a short break. We're going to take a 5-minute break, and we'll be back at 10:35.
Thank you.
Ready to go? Very good. I resume the meeting and declare open this public hearing of the Joint Committee in Public Accounts and Audit for the inquiry into the procurement of mandated national support and advocacy services for victims of child sex abuse, and I thank the witnesses for being here today. I call the representatives from the Attorney-General's Department and the Australian National Audit Office. And for the Hansard record, could you please state your name and the capacity in which you appear before the committee, and we'll start on my right.
Scott Sharp, Chief Financial Officer of the Department.
Kathleen Denley, I'm the Acting First Assistant Secretary of the Children and Families Division.
Lauren Barons, I'm the Assistant Secretary of the National Office for Child Safety.
Ian Goodwin, Group Executive Director, Performance Audit, ANAO.
Rona Mellor, Deputy Auditor General, appearing as Acting Auditor General.
Brian Boyd, Executive Director, Performance Audit Services Group, ANAO.
Thank you all. And we've got a couple of members here with us today and then a few online as well. But we'll come to all of us a bit later. This is a formal proceeding of the Parliament. The giving of false or misleading evidence is a serious matter and may be regarded as a contempt of the Parliament. The evidence given today will be recorded by Hansard and attracts parliamentary privilege. I remind all present today that as Chair, I'll ensure the proceedings are conducted in an orderly, respectful and courteous way. The committee members are again reminded that public officials should not be asked to give opinions on matters of policy, but questions asking for explanations of policies or factual questions about when and how policies were adopted are appropriate. Witnesses are also reminded that any claim that it would be contrary to the public interest to answer a question must be made by a minister and accompanied by a statement setting out the basis for the claim. Should we go to opening remarks and then we'll open up for questions?
We've tabled ours.
Okay.
And you've tabled yours. Fantastic.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you for the opportunity to be here today to talk about the audit into the procurement of the 2 new national child sexual abuse related services. We appreciate the opportunity to discuss what we've learned and how we have responded to the report. To that end, we also want to recognise the work and engagement of the Australian National Audit Office in this process. We know how important these services are. They go to the heart of supporting people affected by child sexual abuse and preventing future harm. The Department has accepted all the findings of the audit, and a key part of that is acknowledging there were areas where mistakes were made and improvements are needed. Once the final report was tabled, we immediately engaged with all key stakeholders and governance groups to reassure them of our serious commitment to addressing the findings and ensuring timely delivery of these vital services. We welcome the opportunity to strengthen our procurement processes and are fully committed to implementing all 6 of the ANAO's recommendations through a whole of organisation approach. Beyond the procurements that were the subject of the audit, we're applying the ANAO's advice to improve other procurement processes and are rolling out departmental-wide enhancements as outlined in the Secretary's response to the Auditor-General on the 7th of June this year. We also want to acknowledge that this is an area of the Department that engages with very difficult subject matter, and this work is spearheaded by a team of dedicated staff in the National Office of Child Safety who have engaged constructively with this process and are focused on embedding the lessons learnt. As the first services of their kind in Australia, we recognise these national initiatives are critical to enhancing prevention and response mechanisms across all settings. We remain committed to addressing the recommendations of the Royal Commission into institutional responses to child sexual abuse, including through the National Strategy to Prevent and Respond to Child Sexual Abuse 2021-2030, and are determined to ensure these new services contribute effectively to preventing and responding to child sexual abuse. Noting the letter sent to the committee yesterday on one of the procurements that was the subject of the audit, and if indeed it is helpful to the committee, I could also give an update on the status of the procurements. But thank you, and we are happy to answer any questions.
Sorry. Okay, let's dive in. Why did it take from the budget in 2021-22 until late 2023 for the department to approach the market?
I guess we need to start to acknowledge that the time taken to complete this process has been longer than originally anticipated, and also to acknowledge the frustration that this may have caused stakeholders. That said, the complexity and sensitivity of the procurements, particularly given the subject matter and the policy context, meant that there was a lot of very careful planning, risk management and stakeholder engagement to ensure that we got this right. And I might hand to my colleague, Ms Barons, to further expand on those timeframes.
Yeah, so we fully accept that the procurements have taken a lot longer than were anticipated. Look, all efforts were made to ensure that these were done in as timely fashion as possible. However, I think the indicative timeframes were quite ambitious because they are the first national services of this nature. There was extensive consultation that was required, and the department was not used to doing procurements of this size, so there was a lot of advice that was needed and advice that was sought throughout.
Can we unpack it a bit though? Mm-hmm. What is? So you get the budget, and that happens in May 2021, and then it's over 2 years since you go to market. Even at best, because you sort of wait until the budget goes through the Parliament, for example, and sort of 1 July where those funds be made available. But the work you would assume would start pretty quickly after you see it in the budget. Why does it take more than 2 years to even go to market?
So the funding was in the 21-22 budget, and at the time it was committed for a 23-24 start. And then the request for quote was in November 23, closed February 24. We do recognise the time that was taken. I think I don't want to overstate, but I'm also careful not to understate the complexity of these processes and the need to get it right. They're contentious services, and there was certainly a lot of engagement with stakeholders on how these should occur, and time was taken to ensure that happened. I think with the value of hindsight, that was too long. It didn't meet expectations, and it didn't deliver on the expectations that people had around how long these services would take to get up and running.
So can we unpack it a bit though? Like what for the benefit of the committee?
We're trying to understand why.
Like I know it took a long time. So what work was going on in the department then? Was there a month-by-month plan? Did you have your own timelines that you set out, knowing that you had to try and meet 2023-24 commencement date? What happened?
Yeah, and look, I think the national strategy is itself very ambitious, but it is rightly so. It needs to be. The timeframes were indicative, and I think, look, it was a small team trying to manage a number of procurements within the team. So in hindsight, again, that would be.
So when did you realise that you weren't going to be able to go to tender before late 2023? If you're a small team, was there any communication back to the government at any point saying, look, you've budgeted us, we're a small team, we can't do this for another 2 years at least? Or did that, because that doesn't seem sort of feasible. When did the department go, this is going to stretch us?
I think I'd have to take on notice exactly the updates that were given to government at the time. I don't have that to hand, but certainly we have tried to provide regular updates.
And I think your question goes to how was this set out, what timeframes were put in place, and when was there awareness that they were slipping. I think there was an approach that was taken that in order to get them right there would be some slippage. Did we get it right? The answer is no, in terms of ensuring that that was adhered to and then looked at as an overarching picture, that timeliness was more of a focus than it was. I think we could get back to you if there's specific questions around more detail around what those timeframes were. There was a plan, as you would expect, but if you're after more detail on
I guess if there was a plan, what did the plan include?
Well, the plans include the anticipated timeframes. However, I think as we worked through those, we did need to get extensive legal advice, probity advice, and also just procurement advice to make sure we were, like, all efforts were taken to follow the correct processes. We didn't get them 100% right. We fully accept that. We have learnt from that. But it did add to the time frame, just getting that advice, acting on that advice.
And if I could add, in terms of the plan, it was clearly in line with Commonwealth procurement. So there was the processes of the planning and approvals, conducting the procurement checklist, the spending delegate checklist, the procurement risk plan, conflict of interest disclosure, the privacy impact statements. Then there was the approach to market, the use of the Commonwealth contracting suite was considered, the request for tenders. Looking at the valuation, there is of course a detailed plan in place within the department about how those are then followed in practice. The value for money assessments that are done, there's the engagement of the probity advisors and procurement advice, and then engagement in the contracting suite. So there's quite a structured process that is followed. There are timeframes, indicative timeframes, that are set against those various stages of the procurement process. But as we said, we recognise in this instance a lot of those timeframes stretched out. Some of that was because of the unique nature of these services, and there was a lot of focus on trying to get it right, because these are one-of-a-kind services that aren't currently in operation anywhere else in Australia.
So NAP7, which I understand is a website and helpline to provide free, nationally available information on all forms of child sexual abuse. I don't want to diminish the work that would be involved in that, but it doesn't seem to me that setting that up and even just going out to market, which I think at the time this audit report was done had not yet occurred. But why does it take that long to develop a procurement for a website and helpline?
Yeah, so again, there was a lot of consultation and research done initially just to also map what services were out there, get an understanding of that before we actually went out to market. So we did go out to market and we did a two-stage process. The first stage, an EOI, went out on AusTender on the 14th of October 2024. That was open for 6 weeks, closed 22nd of November 2024. We then went through the evaluation phase of that and getting all of the requisite advice and approvals. We did also plan to go out to the RFT phase a little earlier in the year. However, we did pause that slightly so we could ensure that we applied the lessons learned from the ANA audit to the RFT phase of NAP7. But we did go out to market there on 16th of July. That closed on the 1st of September, so we're currently in the evaluation phase of that.
So that was NAP7 though, that's
NAP7, yep, so that's the referral and information service.
Okay. But what about NAP10? So what broke down in the conversations that you've just let the committee know?
Thank you. And you would have received the letter yesterday that we sent around NAP10. So that's the National Support Service for the non-offending family members of child sexual abuse perpetrators. So yes, very unfortunately, and as we advised yesterday, a contract hasn't been able to be awarded as an agreement was not able to be reached with the preferred tenderer, and they subsequently withdrew from the process. So that was formalised yesterday, hence immediately letting the committee know. We should note that cessation of those negotiations isn't related to findings of the ANAO report, but it does reflect our obligation to ensure that the delivery of the service is underpinned by ethical, fair and robust procurement practices and in accordance with the Commonwealth procurement rules. Also to note, the department's unable to reconsider any of the previous tender responses received as part of that. And so now we're focused on steps to urgently progress the procurement and delivery. And I would also like to note that while this is not, then we don't have the bespoke national service that was envisaged by the Royal Commission with this particular procurement, that there are existing national services that people can access, like 1800 Respect, Lifeline and Kids Helpline. There's some limitations in what we're able to tell the committee about why that didn't occur, but I think it's fair to say there were non-compliance issues that weren't compliant with the original tender submission were raised, and we notified the tenderer that we couldn't accept new issues in that process in compliance with the Commonwealth procurement rules. So it was a matter of therefore not being able to proceed with the contract.
So maybe that's a good segue into the procurement rules. And maybe if the Auditor General can, or the Acting Auditor General can comment here. There were findings around, so the timelines we've kind of covered, but I might come back to that in a bit. But then when the timelines were not met, contracts, what does it say? Decisions about preferred tenders into contract negotiations, signed contract preferred the tender period. Wasn't there also a situation where the audit concluded the department's approach to procurement audited did not involve open and effective competition, and the selection of the preferred tenderers was not consistent with achieving value for money? Do you want to elaborate on why that conclusion was drawn? Sorry. I'm going to go to the A now, and then I'll come back to you. Thanks. Sorry, Ms. Stanley.
So, Chair, in terms of, maybe I'll unpack it in two parts. In terms of open and effective competition, clearly the department ran competitive processes which involve issuing requests for tender, but that in itself doesn't get you to open and effective competition if you don't conduct those processes in a way which actually mean that people are able to fairly and openly compete for the business. So the thing for us is to look at various things there in terms of how the department conducted the procurements. So for us, some key things there which we point to was, did the department obtain all the information from all the tenderers to actually properly evaluate them? And our conclusion was they did not. The key failing there relates to pricing information. So I think, as the Deputy Chair pointed out, in large part the two tenders, it's not all that the services are to provide, but you're essentially talking about website resources and call centres. The key thing there is, when you're running a call centre, is what's the call volume going to be? What are people going to charge for that? And fairly common practice when you're running tenders for those sort of things is you put call volumes together. Now, not all tenderers actually provided pricing under each of the call volume scenarios, which meant that you can't actually then fairly compare the competing tenderers. So under one of the procurements, the only one where they got, only call volume scenario where they got prices from every competitor was the high volume scenario. Under the other one, the only one where they got prices for every call scenario was the medium volume scenario. So there's no logic to it. It's just that's the only one where, under the two different procurements, people provided all information. So that's all the department evaluated. And as we point out, well, what that does is that unfairly advantages people that didn't provide all the information and penalises those that did. It also means the department's not in a good position to actually reach a sound conclusion as to whether there's value for money, because you don't really know what the range of possible pricing scenarios is. So under NAP 10, which is the procurement which is now not proceeding, one of the things we point out in the audit report is that, having picked a preferred tenderer, the department then had to say to that preferred tenderer, look, your prices as tendered are too high for us, we need some savings. So you're starting to move already very quickly away from the offer that was presented to the market, which for us, as we say, we acknowledge you've run a request for tender, but you're already moving away very early on from the opportunity presented to the market. And the other thing under that particular NAP 10 we point out is the actual tenderer that performed best against the weighted criteria, achieved the highest score, wasn't the preferred tenderer, and the department identified concerns around financial viability, but that tenderer wasn't given a chance to address those concerns. Instead, they proceeded with the lesser ranked one in terms of those scores, but lower price. So again, this is what I'm saying, it's, for us, reaching a conclusion, it's not just straightforward saying you've issued a request for tender to the market. It's everything you do in terms of progressing that as to whether it's open and effective competition. And our conclusion for both of them was that when you looked at everything that was done post receiving tenders, it wasn't open and effective competition. Now, there's a lot of parts of the Commonwealth procurement rules we look at in terms of the second part, in terms of non-compliance. Well, there's broad non-compliance because open and effective competition is actually required under the Commonwealth procurement rules, but there's also some technical non-compliance, as we point to within the audit report around things. And I'm not saying one's more important than the other, but to us, when a tender process is not meeting those very broad obligations of open, effective competition, fair dealing of competitors and so forth, that to us is a more significant non-compliance than if you know, for example, Oz tender reporting. We're not saying it's unimportant and the department didn't do well then, but to us that is in some ways a lesser non-compliance, because it's, and we're not saying you wouldn't expect us to as auditors that transparency is not important, but when fundamentally the way you've conducted the procurements means you can't be confident you're getting a result which is value for money to the taxpayer, that's the more significant thing.
I understand. So was there advice sought around the different pricing models for the tender, or for the high volume, medium volume, as the Auditor General set out?
So, as the NAO highlight, when we went out for pricing as part of the RFT, we did request high, medium and low pricing from each of the tenderers. A large number of them didn't provide that level of detail, both the high, medium and low pricing. The tender evaluation at the time, used the information provided and was able to have a point of similarity across them all, which we used to do as fair an assessment on a consistent basis as possible. In retrospect, I think we would have asked for the pricing in a different way, but we were, to some extent, dealing with what was provided to us. That was still something we asked for, and there's certainly lessons learned about how we document that, how we make sure we go back out to get further information, but the evaluation team concluded they had enough information to do a comparison on prices, even though it was suboptimal to what we actually asked for.
So you did ask for the information, it only came back in a limited capacity, but then as the ANAO just pointed out, there was another tenderer that came back with a higher rating or a higher compatibility with the tendering requirements. Why was the assessment made to go with the lower compatible option? So
there's probably two parts to that. There is the pricing information we got, and we did an assessment based on pricing. Price is just one component of the tender. As part of the tender, there were a number of weighted criteria which we explicitly ask people to respond to. In any value for money assessment, however, we do consider other things such as risk, pricing, value to the Australian economy, and the tender evaluation panel, whilst on the weighted criteria, had one order. When undertaking the final evaluation, they determined that some of the other factors meant that in the overall value for money assessment, they felt that the tenderer who was the highest weighted wasn't the preferred tenderer once taking those other things into consideration, and that's not unusual in procurements. But
so what were those factors?
So in terms of the factors, they're actually outlined in the Audit Office report, and let me just pull them up while we'll look at it. So in table 2.6 of the report, the weighted criteria 1 to 4 are in there, and then we looked at pricing, financial viability, and benefit to the Australian economy as other factors. And for NAP 10, the preferred tender at the time was lower risk for us in terms of pricing and financial viability, and in terms of benefit to the Australian economy came out better as well. So when the tender evaluation panel undertook their analysis, that was their unanimous decision that the preferred tenderer was a better overall option than the one that happened to be the highest ranked on the weighted criteria alone.
So, if it might help, Chair, I mean, I think as Mr Sharp explains it, there were a number of things, but if I maybe step through the various parts, the table 2.3 in the audit report shows that one of the tenderers that provided all of the information, including all of the pricing information, is tenderer 5. If you look at the top row in that table, you see the preferred tenderer, that's where they're missing some of the pricing information. So that's the pricing information. We then go down and we look at, well, what did they achieve in terms of the non-price scores, each of the tenderers? And if you go to figure 2.1 in the audit report on page 44, you see that's where the tenderer 10, who as I say is one of the tenderers that's provided everything asked of them, they're scoring higher than the preferred tenderer, which is the second bar in that figure 2.1. And the other thing Mr Sharp referred to, which is in terms of risk, which is another part of the overall equation, which is table 2.6, shows that, and one of the questions we had there for the department was how, if you look at tenderer 5, which as I say is the one that's provided all the information and has best met the criteria, when you build up their risk scoring, you know, they're low, medium, low, but somehow the department then arrives at medium to high, which to us we don't understand how, when you aggregate these things, the aggregate can be higher than the components. So to us we had some questions around that, but then as we go on in the discussion that follows that to say, well, the way the RFT was framed was you can actually, and this isn't unusual, you can actually engage with more than one tenderer to try and collaborate and clarify to get the best offer on the table. And the question we had for the department, which it didn't record, was, well, why would you only proceed forward to collaborate with the lower scoring but cheaper tenderer and not also seek to engage with the higher scoring, albeit more expensive tenderer that's provided all the information, because you're then keeping some competitive pressure in the process. And I'm not, I don't want to verbal the department, but essentially when we look at it, you know, and I appreciate what's happened in the last 24 hours in terms of NAPTEM now falling over, but even if it hadn't, we're now 20 months after tenders were lodged. And so to us, you've probably gone forward and removed competition at such an early stage, which might help explain why it's then taken so long to try and negotiate to then not get an outcome.
I mean, I guess like, why was the decision made not to go with the overall more compatible tenderer? I mean, that seems like if you were making the basis purely on the pricing point of NAP 10 preferred tenderer, and then you know it all fell apart. I mean, doesn't that leave the department a bit exposed of choosing the less compatible tenderer?
So the overall evaluation isn't just based on the weighted criteria. The tender evaluation panel concluded that the preferred tenderer was the best fit for delivering these services based on both the weighted criteria and some of the unweighted criteria. In retrospect, we should have documented some of that better. I think Mr Boyd makes a good point about the fact that we, you know,
what's the unweighted criteria?
Sorry?
What's the unweighted criteria?
So the unweighted criteria is things around risk, pricing, value to the Australian economy, which were the bits where we didn't have a specific weighting, whereas the other bits where you maybe 20% for this thing, 30% for this part, and it comes out with a score. Whereas the unweighted criteria is those broader considerations around risk and pricing.
So the Auditor General's Department didn't have, on the area that you were making the decision, didn't have a weighted or a specific criteria in which you were making the decision. You chose for the tenderer that was scored better in the area that you felt was better, but didn't have the specific criteria, and then later on that tender fell apart. That's basically what happened.
So the department made a decision based on weighted and unweighted criteria about which was the best fit to deliver these services. It is not unusual for tenders to have weighted and unweighted criteria for making a value for money assessment. We proceeded with what we thought was the best tenderer at that time, and unfortunately that has not resulted in a successful conclusion of the services.
Yeah, go, please.
Regarding the weighted criteria, what I find really disappointing is that for NAP 10 and NAP 21 services, the weighted criteria was service delivery, apparently, as we in the ANAO report. But in fact, you've actually not delivered any services now since you received the budget. So whilst you're waiting potential providers, that receives the highest weighting. Literally, overall, you know, you've completely failed in the service delivery part, which is your highest weighting, like to the point that there's no services. I also, like, within that weighting system, you know, we saw in the report that there's just misalignment with, you know, NAP 21 preferred tenderer, on time, minimum content and format, green light, conditions for participation, green light, and then they've basically been rejected. Like, I think there's just such a misalignment between, you know, the preferred tenderers and then whether you've progressed that tender or not. But overall, I think, you know, if you stated service delivery, if you stated weighting as service delivery, you've absolutely failed for like 3 or 4 years. Do you have any comment on that?
I think the service delivery is once the services are up and running, not in the negotiation of the contract itself. So the negotiation of the contracts itself are quite detailed and complex, but when you and I fully accept what you're saying, that the service is not up and running, and also acknowledge the deficiencies that have been highlighted. But when it comes to how service delivery was being assessed, that was once there was a contract in place, not in contract negotiations.
No, I completely understand it, but it's just ironic, isn't it?
I understand your point, Senator.
Deputy Chair.
Thank you. I just want to go to the Evaluation Committee and the conflicts of interest. I'll just read from page 56, paragraph 2, 140. The Auditor General has written, in July 2023, the Chair of the Evaluation Committee declared an apparent conflict of interest relating to professional relationships with organisations in the sector who may tender for both NAP 10 and NAP 21 procurements. The declarations were vague and did not provide a transparent record of the nature of conflict and the decision-making process. The Department's records did not explain the nature of the professional relationships with organisations who may tender for NAP 10 procurement. For NAP 21, the conflict of interest was due to the Chair having been a member of the advisory group for a pilot service that was run by the eventual preferred tenderer. Why did the Department's records fail to explain the nature of the Evaluation Committee Chair's professional relationships with the organisations who may tender for NAP 10 procurement?
Look, I will say that all efforts were made, so genuine efforts were made to comply with putting conflicts of interests declarations in. We did have a register that was maintained throughout the procurement processes. Where conflicts or potential conflicts arose, advice was sought and received from probity advisors, and then that advice was actioned. All members of the tender evaluation received a probity briefing. However, we do recognise that some of the attempts at meeting those requirements did fall short.
Well, the Auditor General found that you didn't explain the nature of the professional relationships. So why not?
One of the important things here is that you use the word comply. And compliance is important, but we'd say compliance plus. You have a senior person who has made a decision that their participation in a professional relationship does not bring bias to being the delegate of a tender. The best thing to do is to let someone else decide that. And so complying with filling out forms and everything is one thing, but actually accepting that risk of bias, risk of conflict in a procurement can lead to poor results. And I'm not suggesting that the perceived potential or real conflict here has had a bearing, but it kind of looks like that. And so having a second person, more senior person with different judgment, look at stuff and go, yeah, nah, is more important than filling out the forms. And I think what we're seeing here is a little mix of, we put all this stuff in place, but at the end of the day, senior people need to own the fact that their own connections and relationships can actually bring bias to procurement. And I think it would be fair to say that through the audit, that's not what we saw. A real thoughtfulness about that. Compliance, yeah, tick, tick, tick. But thinking about the impacts that perceived real conflicts can have on decisions is a really important senior executive. It's a capability and it needs to be exercised.
And if I can respond, we fully accept that. And I think especially in an area such as the National Office of Child Safety and this particular sector, which is quite a tight sector. Yep. There's a smaller number of stakeholders compared to some other sectors. Just by virtue, by the nature of the work, there are going to be a lot of professional interactions and a lot of relationships with key stakeholders. So it's an absolutely valid point, and it's not just whether there is bias, but it's that perception and ensuring that that documentation really covers off that risk and is addressed. Fully accept that that needs to be tightened up, which, and I'm sure we'll get to the uplift we've done since the report recommendations, and of course we accepted all 6 of those recommendations, but the uplift within the department we've done, not only in the processes but also ensuring that there's a cultural uplift and understanding with staff of how important these processes are. So we fully take that on board, because it's not just the doing, it's the seen to be doing and what sits behind that.
Correct. The next paragraph really goes into something that I find quite extraordinary. For the benefit of people listening in, it says that the chair did not accept the initial advice from the procurement team that she should not chair the committee, and requested the team prepare a minute for her signature that detailed advice from Asterix that the risks associated with her chairing the committee, mainly to show ANAO that we considered the question and that the chair has decided to wear the risk. While a draft minute was prepared, the minute was not finalised. I mean, I find this quite extraordinary, particularly given it's minuted to deliberately point out that, you know, the ANAO may have a look at this at some point. Well, guess what? They have. So what date what was the date that the chair requested the minute to be prepared, explaining that the committee has decided to wear the risk?
We might need to get back to you on the specific date, but I mean, as to the ANAO comment, I can't speak to the mind of the chair, but I think in the department we do. It might have been a lighthearted way to highlight that we take our obligations seriously when we're looking at the probity of processes we're doing, and whether that was then a reference to the ANAO to highlight that in people's minds, I'm not sure. But I think the
consistent with what we see in the sector. We see when people do that, that their mindset isn't about doing the right thing, it's about showing the right thing when the ANAO comes in. And we see it. It's not just AGD where we've seen what you describe as lighthearted. We don't take it as lighthearted. We take it as defensive in that issue, not a culture of good compliance and approach. People should...
Can I also say, it's like that comment of it being a light-hearted reflection is a bit concerning in that there is potentially a conflict of interest that that the chair has decided to wear the risk and only minute it mainly to show that the ANAO that we considered the question. If that was a light-hearted approach, I mean, like how is it acceptable that there's a light-hearted approach, especially when we come back to the fact that now, as today, the committee's just received a letter saying that the whole contract's fallen apart, and that also the conflict of interest that this person was meant to be managing ended up coming up as a medium risk for the tenderers when the low risk for the tenderers was overlooked. And the Auditor General found that that the low risk was overlooked, and that the person who's meant to be, managing this conflict of interest managed to convince the department to pursue a medium risk tenderer that's now fallen apart. I mean, a light-hearted approach seems like the last thing that's needed right now.
I accept that, Chair. I'm sorry I misspoke. What I was meaning to indicate that it could have been, and again, I can't speak to the mind of the person who wrote the minute, but it could have been a way to highlight that there are obligations we need to comply with. However, I fully take on board the point of the seriousness of that and the experience that the ANAO has had, and we take that on board. By no means do we take this in a light-hearted manner, and I didn't mean to undermine the seriousness of the issue.
Thank you for confirming that. Was the department's procurement team instructed to disregard the minute preparation by the chair?
Do we have that detail?
I don't think we have that detail with us, so we'll need to come back to you on that. I would say, though, as I mentioned earlier, look, I know that all involved in this process did take their obligations very seriously and did make all attempts to actually meet the requirements of them. So while we did fall away from the conflict of interest process, and that was found, and we have learned from that, and we've put improvements in, certainly all requirements, like all efforts were made to actually make those declarations and highlight them to the people required. We didn't do it in the right way, and we didn't document it in the right way, and I fully understand that, and as I said, we've learned and we take that, but I will say that all efforts were made by the people involved.
How then has the department allowed for the individual with the conflict, declared the conflict, determined how the conflict of interest is then managed?
And I might see if Scott wants to talk about our conflict of interest process, but certainly the way the conflicts of interest process is managed is a declaration is made and it does go to another person to assess what they've actually declared and how they're mitigating any potential risks or perceived risks.
Is that what's happened here? Because it looks to me that, so you've got the person that's got a conflict and they're the ones determining how conflicts are managed. Like, it doesn't... certainly doesn't seem best practice to me.
Ms Barnes was correct. Our process is somebody will put a conflict in, it will go to somebody else to manage. In this case, and it's mentioned in paragraph 2.143 afterwards, that we actually did provide advice to a more senior officer on this. The nature of that advice was a noting brief, however, which was not appropriate in the circumstances compared to an actual approval process, which is how we'd normally do it. So there was visibility of this and the decision was being made. However, the way we actually noted that position was suboptimal in relation to the management of it. I'd also probably note, Mr Barnes, you previously noted that we accepted the low risk tender over the medium risk tenderer. When we look at the decision the tender evaluation panel made, we actually accepted what we thought overall was a lower risk tenderer in terms of price and risk, not the medium risk tenderer in terms of the evaluation panel's outcomes. But I appreciate the concerns about the conflict of interest and how we documented and managed that.
Thanks. Just conscious of time, I do want to go to another issue, but just before I do, on what basis did the department advise the delegate for the procurement that the officer is the most suitable person to chair the committee?
Again, I might need to check for the detail on that. The person who chaired the committee was the most senior person in the National Office of Child Safety at that point in time, and we certainly wanted senior oversight of all of the procurements.
And to ensure that there was the right expertise as well being brought to the procurements and understanding of the services that were required.
Okay. Can I have a few more minutes, Chair?
Yep.
I'll flick over to page 57, paragraph 2142. It says that in May 2023, advice from the department's probity officer, Asterix, was that the officer's involvement be limited to providing advice as required on strategy as a subject matter expert. The advice was changed in 2023 August 2023, after the department advised Asterix that it was prepared to accept the risk and that the chair had withdrawn from the advisory group for the pilot program on the 24th of July 2023. Asterix's initial advice in May 2023 regarding the chair's conflict of interest was then changed in August 2023 after the department advised Asterix that it was prepared to accept the risk and the chair had withdrawn from the advisory group for the pilot program on the 24th of July. So is it correct that the chair withdrew from the advisory group after only after requesting to dismiss Asterix probity concerns?
That's a fair question, Senator, and I don't know the answer immediately, so I would like to get further detail on that.
Yeah, we can get further detail, but my understanding is that the chair withdrew from the advisory group as one of the mitigations against potential conflict of interests, and then made a number of other steps to ensure that they would be in a position to chair that committee without bias, such as doing the required declarations and seeking that senior oversight. But as Mr Sharp said, unfortunately that was through a noting rather than seeking formal agreement.
I think, again, there's paperwork. The real question here, regardless of the timing, is whether by stepping out of an advisory group in a stakeholder environment actually removes the bias. And that's the question that hasn't been addressed in the paperwork. So if you've got a very close stakeholder relationship and it's been identified as a potential bias, just moving off the advisory group of itself does not necessarily remove the bias. So it's not paperwork, it's thinking. And I think what we're seeing here is, we saw it in the previous session as well, a leaning into the paperwork, not the thinking. The risk of bias remains even in changed circumstances. And so the thinking wasn't very thoughtful, perhaps, on this issue.
Then it goes on to say that a NAP 21 evaluation committee member did not declare an existing conflict of interest with a tenderer until 11 April 2024. This was after evaluations had commenced and the consensus meeting had been held. So if a NAP 21 evaluation committee member did not declare an existing conflict of interest with a tenderer until after the evaluations had commenced and the consensus had been held, what correctional measures has the department taken in regards to this committee member?
I don't have detail on that. We'll have to take that one on notice. However, we have done a large uplift in the procurement processes and the conflict of interest process within the department as a result of the lessons learned from this process. And certainly in any procurement processes at the moment, all committee members are reminded of the requirement to update their conflict of interest form on a regular basis, because it may be only when you're doing an evaluation that you actually realise there might be a perceived conflict of interest if you haven't realised there is a connection there as well.
And I think at the risk of repeating myself again, I appreciate the comments that you're making. It's not just the paperwork, it's what sits behind it, and it's the intention and the integrity of the process. And while it's not my understanding that it was ever just a tick and flick exercise, I think what this has highlighted for us is that it's really important that there's an awareness of why we're doing this and to think into that reasoning that sits behind it. Again, particularly when you're in areas like this one, where it is a smaller stakeholder group, there's many interactions where staff have engagement with stakeholders who are going to be involved in these procurements, which makes it all the more important that it's not just the actual conflict of interest, it's the perceived conflict of interest. These steps are then looked at by a third party. The conflict of interest forms are then looked over by someone else. But it's also that uplift piece within the organisation within the actual branch itself around what a conflict is, what it looks like, and the things to be aware of.
I think that's right. I think the other piece of thinking that people need to bring to procurement and evaluation panels is what you're evaluating. And in stakeholder engagement environments where there's policy or program opportunity, it may not be relevant in the evaluation at all points. And so how you populate an evaluation process may not lean into that policy and program area at all. And that starts to help with the diminution of potential conflict immediately. So I think there's always a compliance thing, but more thinking about how do we get to this outcome in the best way, fair, all of the components of the CPRs, and do we actually need the heavily engaged policy and program people in the procurement in anything other than advisory would be a really good starting point in small program areas.
And I think if I may, just drawing on that point as well and noting what's been referenced, it's not the first time issues like this have arisen. I want to highlight that we are really engaged within the department on what's next and how we're dealing with this going forward. We do look at the ANAO audits. There's a helpful part of every audit which tells you lessons learnt for other agencies as well. And one of the uplift pieces we've done is establish an internal community of practice where we can have a really frank discussion about these issues and make sure that they're aired. It's really to strengthen our procurement practices. We're not a department that has done a lot of large-scale procurements. We fully accept there's lessons to be learnt in this, and we're very keen to get it right going forward. So I think we really want to just then share the expertise that by default we're building up and developing those practical tools and embedding that continuous learning. There is a real enthusiasm and engagement with this. I think it's been a helpful wake-up call, the audit itself. There are a lot of lessons and we are taking them very seriously.
Can you just explain Asterix, who they are, what role they played? And I understand they actually had a bit of a dual function here. Did they have something to do with the procurement and the probity? So is there not an issue having an organisation involved in both of those functions, given that they need to be, I think, at arm's length from each other?
Yeah, so we did engage a single external consultant in Asterix via a subcontract arrangement for the procurement and the probity advice. We treated it as a specialised advisory service and extended an existing contract by retainer in this particular circumstance. It was considered justified under the exemption, so the small to medium enterprise exemption, rather than opening a full competitive new tender. While we had logic for that, we accept that that was problematic. The logic, just for the context, not to excuse the outcome, because we agree that we wouldn't do that again, and we've put things in place to ensure that doesn't happen. But the thinking behind it at the time was that it was an existing relationship. There was continuity of service in that approach, as they were already engaged as the probity advisor.
Sorry. I'm just going to have to jump in there.
Yes.
Isn't that a massive red flag, though, that they're already engaged with the department? You've engaged them on probity advice, and then they're suggesting that they also be used for procurement advice as well.
In this circumstance, it was, if I can say, administratively expedient. We did have an eye on the timing at this point, and we wanted to ensure continuity of service. It was allowed under the SME. Should we have done it? No, we wouldn't do it again. We've put things in place, but it wasn't something that...
and it clearly hasn't helped expedite things.
Well, but not only that. So hang on, the chair of the evaluation committee also, their conflict wasn't managed. And then the conflict, which sort of seems to be screaming at us, is that the contractor advising the department on probity was also advising the department on procurement. And in all of that process, the low-risk tender option was dismissed and the medium risk tender option, which apparently also has a conflict of interest with the chair, was chosen. I mean, this is like more than just sort of we're hoping to uplift our capability. This seems like a massive failure by the department.
So, Chair, we accept that having a property advisor and procurement advisor as the same entity is far from best practice. The issue around the low and medium, you allude to us again, the tender evaluation panel concluded that the preferred tenderer we went with was the lower risk tenderer, not the medium risk tenderer, which is actually in the non-weighted criteria from the Audit Office report as well. But like, we accept that the approach of having a procurement advisor and probate advisor as the same entity is far from better practice, and we have learnt that lesson. We'll never do it again. I'm
going to go to Aileen in a second, but is that around just the advice from Auditor General? Is that true around the assessment of the low and medium risk, or was that different for the two different NAPs?
I think there's a few different assessments being perhaps being conflated, but maybe irrespective of whether we're talking about the weighted criteria, the pricing analysis, the risk analysis, if we start pulling some of those things together and you go back in Chapter 2 to around paragraph 254, you'll see one of the challenges we have with just taking the evaluation outcomes at face value is, in terms of how that's pulled together, we run through, so starting around paragraph 254, well, the worksheets for the evaluation committee members largely not being completed. The consensus meetings of the tender evaluation committee when it came together, the records are sometimes inaccurate, sometimes inconsistent, sometimes incomplete. So it's very hard for us then to be confident that the conflicts which haven't been well identified and well managed, for us to be confident they haven't then led to actual bias in the assessment process, and then to be completely confident in what then results from all that is value for money.
Yeah.
So I mean, this is as the Auditor General says, it's not just about paperwork, but when you have errors and shortcomings building upon errors and shortcomings, suddenly the sum of the whole of all those errors and shortcomings becomes such. And so then with both these procurements, we're sitting in a situation where the tender offer periods were 6 months. So they both tendered in February of 2024. Tenders ran out in August of 2024. We said to the department in December 2024, hang on, how are you negotiating when the tenders have expired? In January 2025, they got agreement from the two preferred tenderers to essentially go back in history and now extend their offer periods out till April. They then did a second extension out to the end of July. They managed to get one of them signed, the NAP 21 signed. They extended NAP 10 out until the end of October. They've told you now that's fallen over. Well, we're now so far from the market being approached and preferred tender has been selected. It's not just that they're no longer meeting their own timeframes. The point we make, the last sentence in the overall audit conclusion says, effectively from our perspective, you're no longer running the RFT process, they're now limited tenders because you are so far removed from that approach to the market with everything that's happened and logic says that if you're actually negotiating at the margins of the offers you accepted, why is it taking you so long?
Correct. So, sorry, Chair.
You want to go one and then we'll get to Aileen and then
sorry,
Carol. Sorry, yep. We've still got time, Aileen, Carol. Sorry, apologies.
Yeah, thanks. I appreciate the indulgence. Like you said that it was that they were contracted, Asterix were contracted under an exemption, yet it was meant to be an open tender, wasn't it? So how can they both be correct?
There's a number of procurements involved in this. So as part of the tender, there was open tenders for the actual services.
Yes.
And there's a lot of other procurements that are outlined in the Audit Office report for advisors, consultants, etc. that were part of the broader exercise. So Asterix were not one of the tenderers that was done.
Because it was under the threshold
under
value.
Procurement threshold,
Yeah.
so they were one of our advisors,
Okay.
etc. So that's slightly different. So the actual services we're seeking to get was done through an open tender.
No, thanks,
and the Audit Office have rightly pointed out that within some of our support contracts, we were variable in our approaching to the market, and that's all in the report.
Aileen?
Thank you, Chair. I just want to point out that I think for me the most shocking thing about all of this is that you know, we've gone years, as I said earlier, of not having this national service for some of our most vulnerable community members, and, you know, it's supposed to go into stopping child sexual abuse and to supporting child sexual abuse victims. While I understand that, you know, you're learning from this and you've put in place some mechanisms, you're still the Attorney General's department. And this idea that, you know, you've not got a lot of experience in large scale procurement, you still understand rules, you still understand contracts, you still understand procurement, you write legislation. The idea that you know, the department in general couldn't get up to speed with that, I think is totally unacceptable. So my next question is that although there was no, and in this vein, although there was no financial viability criteria for NAP 10 procurement, you still, you know, set out in the RFT, the tenderer with the highest weighted score was not selected because of the, you know, because of financial viability. So we've gone through some of the examples before, but for others, on page 48 of the report, it says, in relation to the other front-runner, NAP 10 tenderer 5, which received the highest score against the weighted criteria, the department noted it could not conceive of any collaboration activities that could alleviate the serious concerns around NAP 10 tenderer 5's financial stability. Inconsistent with this, the financial advisor had provided a risk rating of low to medium in relation to the tenderer's financial viability. And as stated previously, the tenderer was not afforded the same opportunity to address the department's concerns with its tender response. So why did you rate the financial viability criterion when it wasn't in the RFT and rate it higher? And then why was that tenderer not given any opportunity to address concerns through collaboration? And if you want to also extrapolate on the fact that I feel like now we've got to the point that, you know, we've ruled out all these tenderers, we still don't have a service. We've ruled out all these people on really, you know, unacceptable procurement processes, and now we still don't have a tenderer.
I might hand to my colleague Mr Sharp to talk again in some detail about NAP 10. I do want to address the point, though, about the department's experience with procurement. My comment wasn't meant to convey that the department does not know how to do procurements. The department has a lot of we've got a probity unit, we've got a procurement unit, and the department is fully capable of putting these procurements through. At the same time, what this audit has shown is that there are areas where deficiencies have been highlighted. We take them seriously, and we absolutely are committed to doing that uplift, and we are very committed to deliver these services. 3 complex, large-scale procurements all happening simultaneously has presented challenges, and that was the point that I was trying to underline. But in terms of the NAP 10, I'm not sure if Mr Sharp has anything to add to the comments that we've made previously.
Yeah, I think it gets into the area where we have those unweighted criteria. Financial viability is important to us. We don't want to stand up a service that may not make it through the contract period. The tender evaluation panel at the time considered all these things: financial viability, pricing, and the weighted criteria, and overall, based on that, decided that they thought it was a higher risk to go with the one that scored higher on the weighted criteria than the other one, and that was the consensus of our evaluation panel, taking into consideration a number of factors that weren't necessarily weighted. Look, there's always opportunities to improve how we document those outcomes, but certainly we had a panel that was drawn from the department and from other experts that looked at all the tenders and came to that conclusion.
I just say, I think from our perspective, it's not about documentation. Firstly, there was no financial viability criterion. The department's in stating that there was in its evaluation, that's just wrong. There was no financial viability criterion. Yes, no one's saying it's not a factor, but they've said there was a criterion and there wasn't. They've then, when you go to, as you say, page 48, they've used financial viability in a way that's not consistent with their own RFT as a basis for not progressing a tenderer that had otherwise provided everything it had been asked to provide, had scored higher against the weighted criteria. Now, the reason you weight some criteria, not others, is because you're saying to the market, this is more important. Now, to us, the fact that they've scored, and not just a little bit higher, but markedly higher, that is something we would suggest is of some import in any procurement process. And then that paragraph 2.100, essentially, perhaps our audit speaks too obscure there. We're basically saying the reason the department gave for saying that we couldn't conceive of collaborating with them is simply inconsistent with its own records. They're saying this risk is too high. Their own records say the risk is low. So none of this adds up for us in this, and then saying as in a scenario, well, you've then decided we won't progress this higher performing tenderer that's provided everything you asked for at the same time as the one you seem to be preferring, so that we might actually get to a contract.
That's exactly the way I saw it.
We're going to go Carol, and then we'll go Mary, and then if there's, we might need to extend by a few minutes if that's okay. We'll see how we go. Carol.
Thank you, and apologies. We've got some works happening outside, so if it becomes noisy, please let me know. Just, you mentioned that there was quite significant engagement with stakeholders at the commencement of this process when you were thinking about the design of these services. Could you tell us a little bit more about the nature of that stakeholder engagement? And did you get feedback through that process around, how the service should be designed? And once you developed the actual services that you were going to tender for, did you get further feedback around how those services were resourced and whether or not that was a realistic and viable proposition for people that were going to tender for those services?
Yeah, look, I might have to take on notice the exact nature of the stakeholder consultation, just in terms of exactly who was consulted, the dates and the research that was undertaken. But we certainly did engage also with other agencies who provide similar national services to try and get an understanding of what the service might entail and understand exactly what was required in going out to market. It is the first time we've tried to establish services of this nature in a national sense. So there was... we did need to get a proper understanding of exactly what was required and also what was going to be the most effective service that we could provide. So there was, as I said, a lot of communications, but I will take on notice the exact nature of the consultation.
And I think if it assists, the work of the National Office is very broad. It covers, and I might get Ms Barons to outline that in just a snapshot of detail to create a picture. But we do have stakeholders that sit across the spectrum, and there's a whole range of ways in which we engage with them on the various different subject matters, and they have been kept regularly updated through that. Did you want to give an outline of some of the work of the office?
Slightly. Within government, the audit report points to some consultation with the Department of Social Services in relation to 1800 Respect. And that is a nationally recognised service, procured, managed, has backup plans, all sorts of things. And I think your point about it being the first procurement of a service of this nature is quite an important one, because now you're going to go into a new deliver this service in the events of the last 24 hours. And there is a strong argument when one decides to procure something is to look for someone else who already does it. And particularly if it's a Commonwealth spend, and to actually assess whether or not someone else who does it could actually do it. One of the reasons we chose this audit is because service delivery is not a recognised normal function of AGD. AGD is the First Law Officer's department, it does the rules, all the sort of things that Ms Francis has said. And while for the department a procurement of around $10 million is seen to be big, for us it's not. And we don't have a hypothesis that says a $10 million one should be easy, because they are all of their own nature. But I think we're at a point now where the services that were expected to be delivered with the government's agreement to the recommendations of the Royal Committee are not. And there's a real question for, I think, the department, is procurement of a service, having gone, even with uplift, having gone through this experience, the right thing, and what other design options could you very quickly get through your department and your minister and the Commonwealth and do something that delivers these services that have not been delivered?
That is exactly where we've gone in terms of where else things like 1800 Respect, or in terms of where else across the Commonwealth these services are operating, and if there are mechanisms that we should now look at afresh.
And so just to get an answer on one of my questions that I asked, when you did provide information to the sector around what services you were procuring for, did you get feedback around whether or not the way that had been designed, the way that you were resourcing it, was going to be achievable?
I'll have to take the exact question on notice, but in terms of the consultation, look, as I mentioned, we did baseline mapping of the service sector across Australia. We conducted trauma-informed and culturally safe consultation with victims and survivors and other priority groups, and we also consulted with states and territories as well, given they are also partner to the national strategy. And yes, in terms of, look, when we went out to market, we were confident that we had undertaken the necessary steps to ensure that it was going to be a process that would deliver the services that were required, having undergone those consultations. Of course, we continue to get feedback. We engage with, under the National Strategy, we have a number of advisory groups. So the National Strategy Expert Advisory Group meets quite regularly, and all measures under the National Strategy are taken to those groups just to really get their feedback. We really take that on board and try and embed that in the processes that we're undertaking. It's really valuable, and we need that to be able to deliver the services as they're required for victim survivors and others that are affected by child sexual abuse.
So just in terms of now delivering these services under NAP 10, given you are back to square one, and if you haven't received sort of feedback around the way you've designed the service, what you're going out to the market for, and your learnings therefore are around the way that the process that you've gone through, what do you intend to do differently, if anything, to ensure that these services can be delivered in a timely fashion?
Look, so as Ms Denley said, we are looking at other opportunities in terms of how can we actually get this up and running as fast as possible to ensure that these are provided. But we are still, look, this all happened essentially yesterday in terms of the process concluding. So we do need to look carefully at what the next steps are. And in terms of the next process that runs, of course, we'll examine any feedback we've received. In the meantime, we'll talk to our advisory groups, and we'll look at what's happened in the time that's passed since we first went to market as to whether there does need to be any adjustments made, but also what the best process is to ensure that we can get this happening as soon as possible. We do realise how valuable these services are, and I should say everyone in the National Office for Child Safety does work very hard. They're very committed to ensuring better outcomes for all Australians impacted by child sexual abuse. I've got a really dedicated team and they're very committed to this work.
And just one final question, if that's okay. Given the significant credibility issues which have arisen from the delays in delivering on these projects and the fact that you're now back to square one with NAP 10, what are you doing to restore confidence in what you can deliver?
As we did as soon as the audit was tabled, we wrote straight to our stakeholders to discuss what had happened. It's been a topic of conversation in the various advisory groups, and yesterday at the same time that Ms Barons wrote to the committee, she also wrote out to all of the stakeholders and invited any of them to contact her as well. I think having been to one of the National Strategy Advisory Group meetings, it's an incredibly impressive and dedicated group, and they are certainly passionate about what they're doing, and rightly so. There's a lot of lived experience in the advisory group, but also a deep commitment, which, as Ms Barons has outlined, which is shared by the staff of the National Office of Child Safety, to ensure that these services are delivered. So there is a conversation, there are open lines of communication. We are very happy to take any questions that the stakeholders have, and we engage with them very regularly.
Thank you.
Thanks, Carol. Mary?
Thanks, Chair. Look, really off the back of my colleague Ms France's questions, I take your point that this is not an area of deep experience with the department, but also you're not exactly under-resourced and under-prepared in dealing with probity and regulatory frameworks. So I'm just concerned about whether you're familiar or aware of any other circumstances by which this has been the practice, approach or policy of the department to go forward in this way.
So, as we said, we don't do a lot of open tenders as a department. There is broad awareness of all the tenders we currently have on hand. They're reported up through to our audit committee and exec in terms of large, more complex procurements to keep an eye on them. In terms of the approach, I mean, each tender will be done slightly differently by the tender valuation panel. We provide support, guidance, etc. One of the key things we have engaged in with the department was, as we said to the ANA as part of the response, we've updated an entire suite of documents with better guidance, etc. We reached out to colleagues across the Commonwealth who do some of this stuff more often. So we reached out to the Department of Finance, reached out to Home Affairs, reached out to some other big areas to get best of breed documentation. We then worked very closely with our colleagues in the commercial area of the Australian Government Solicitor and have a whole suite of enhanced guidance documents, templates, checklists, etc. to make sure these things are mitigated into the future. In terms of current procurements that are on foot, we have discussed with any of those tenders that are on foot at the moment, reminded them about these things, provided the templates. My procurement team engages with them on a regular basis. So we are doing everything we can to make sure that across the organisation we uplift knowledge and understanding. There's been a series of information articles put out to the department. We are planning to have mandatory training for a number of things, which has been an interesting experience because everybody in the Commonwealth seems to have access to different procurement training. So again, we're trying to get best of breed there and then share the work we've done across the portfolio more broadly in the Commonwealth where that will be helpful as well. So we are doing all we can to make sure we avoid the mistakes that have been highlighted in these tenders and taking it seriously. And a number of those actually, the significant ones sit in the NOC space as well, so they've got real lived experience of having to deal with these tenders, and they're looking to make sure that they improve them in the current suite of tenders at the moment and anything going forward. So it's been a very useful experience for us to improve in these spaces, and whilst the department doesn't do these very often, the other element that we're sort of reflecting a little bit is the sector we're dealing with doesn't do these sort of procurements very often either. So there's probably a lack of experience in responding to these sort of complex tenders in the sector as well. So where we can help uplift the sector is something we'll sort of look at as well. Obviously being very aware of probity in those spaces, but making our tender documentation easier to respond to, etc., will help these entities that they're not the big end of town that have large teams that are responding to tenders. They're generally in that not-for-profit sector and aren't as used to dealing with these sort of arrangements as well, which has been a learning for us.
Ms Aldred, one of the things we've seen elsewhere in the Commonwealth when an audit of this nature is handed to the Parliament about a department's performance, all of the things that the witnesses are saying, uplift training, documentation, etc., is what assurance framework does that department then put in place to assess whether or not those uplift improvements, documentation actually happen, and what's in flight at the moment. And to be fair to the Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade, we presented a report on procurement in the Australian Passports Office that had a wide number and deep number of deficiencies in it. And to its credit, that department not only did uplift documentation, reminder, etc., it actually conducted extensive internal audits across its own procurements to see if the deficiencies that we had identified in this part of the agency were common, and has put in place an uplift against a whole range of things, and in fact found that some of the things that we reported in that report were systemic. So there is opportunities for taking not just the blow of the individual audit, but really leveraging your own assurance processes to continue to demonstrate that that good practice is actually in place.
Certainly, that's something we actually have looked at. So we actually just took our internal audit plan to Exec Board recently, and part of what we're looking at in there is both getting some internal work in procurement, but actually we've recognised that as these contracts move on, contract management is another really important part there. So we're also looking to make sure that we're getting some internal audit work over contract management as well. It's not you do the procurement and then you set and forget. There's a really lot of important work in contract management as well. So we're looking to get internal auditors to look at that space.
I'm very conscious of time. We're going to go over it slightly, and I'm going to hand over to the Deputy Chair. A comment you made before, Mr Sharp, about the sector being inexperienced in these sorts of tenders. Is that your impression, Auditor General?
I think you're talking about the sector in which you tendered, the market,
the market
not the public sector. And so I'm not sure that we could comment on that, except that some of the tenderers, as I recall, were already providing services of a similar nature in a narrower market. So there was experience in the market.
Deputy Chair.
Thank you. Conscious of time as well. So I just want to deal with what I'd characterise a few anomalies that are remaining in the report. And I'll go to page 52, paragraph 2.120. And I might get the ANAO just to comment briefly first, and then I'll get a response from the department. So the analysis found that the department paid Asterix $150,426 above the work that was performed when comparing the amount paid to the work performed according to the timesheets. Can I just get a bit of an explanation for this? It does seem odd.
Well, what it relates to is, and this is where I say Asterix on their recommendation said you should engage us for procurement advice as well as probity advice. And the arrangement they went into, therefore, of no competition was a retainer model. So essentially, Asterix is being paid a retainer each month just to be available, and what we then measured was the difference between what is being paid in a retainer and their actual timesheet, saying how much work are they actually putting in. And if you go to that chart on the next page, you'll see what we're basically saying here is this retainer model, which isn't that common for these sort of services in our experience, you're essentially paying to have someone there available if and when you might need them. And this is someone to say they've got this second gig without any competition. So we're saying, well, that hasn't really been tested through a market as to whether it's good value for money outcome. And then we're looking at it and saying, well, more often than not, you're paying them in a retainer more than you're actually obtaining from them in services, which to us doesn't seem to be a great return for the taxpayer.
And so does that then, did you want to comment on that? Was there anything you wanted to add to that?
We wouldn't use that model again.
Okay.
Point taken.
So does that then explain why, going on to page 53, that most of the expenses on probity services, being 78%, was incurred in the period between May 2022 and October 23 prior to the release of the RFTs for NAP 10 and NAP 21? Does that explain that?
Well, not really, because what it seems to us to point more to is the fact that Asterix was keen on providing procurement advice and the department was more keen on obtaining procurement advice and probity advice. And I guess what we're saying to is, given what the audit's revealed, we'd suggest there really was a genuine need here to have independent, objective probity advice more so than another procurement advisor, because, I mean, accept what they're saying in terms of the department may not do a lot of these procurements, but Australian Government Solicitor is part of the department, and they're quite experienced in the procurement space. So it's not like within the department more broadly there is an expertise in the procurement advice space. We're saying, well, perhaps what was needed here was actually more leaning on probity advice once you actually finally got to market, and less getting extra procurement advice from a commercial provider.
Yeah, it's sort of passing strange for me that that most of a probity service provider's functions exclude advising on probity matters, given that you've got $105,617 incurred in the period between May 2022 and October 23 prior to the release of RFTs. So most of the work's actually involved, prior to it even going out. So how does that? Why is so much of the contract actually going to work that was before you'd even released the RFTs?
I think the simple answer is the team were trying to do the right thing, and they were trying to get the advice they needed, or they thought they needed at the time. On reflection, yes.
I think what we found, we say in the audit report, is that's because most of that work in that period was developing frameworks, like you're documenting a probity plan, so you're setting up frameworks to apply, but then the probity advisors are not there to actually make sure that those frameworks are being adhered to, and what's the implication of things, making sure that tender valuation worksheets are being completed, make sure it all builds up, making sure there's a logic there that, well, why are you not taking two through to collaboration when one's better on these things but you're keener on this one because it's a lower price. All these things is where you need the probity advice, we would suggest, not just having a well-crafted probity plan.
So in August 2023, the department recorded that the quality of Asterix's work on NCOS projects had been deteriorating and failed to meet a satisfactory standard, noting that the amount paid to Asterix did not reflect the quality or quantity of the work or advice. In February 2025, Asterix advised that the ANO that the department had not raised any concerns with Asterix regarding its services. So, how do those two facts stand?
Well, I mean, the next paragraph just notes that we did advise ANAO that the matters raised in relation to that were an isolated incident, and the advice that was received from Asterix across the branch had been useful, and the concerns that had been raised that are referred to there were not substantiated.
Okay. I'm conscious of time, Chair. I'm happy to put the rest on those.
What was the total amount paid to Asterix?
So they were involved in a whole range of works. So
I have, I think the actual amount spent under the contract is $318,991.75. I will note that they have been engaged, or they were engaged under a number of procurement processes as they were getting up and running, and for general probity advice as well. So it doesn't just relate to this particular contract.
So 300 and something. Was it 380?
318.
In total.
Correct.
Table 1.2 in the audit report gives you the contract value for both contracts, both the probity advice one, which the reported value for that was $298,000.
So what page is that on?
That's on page
21.
21. And then there's also the separate contract, obviously, for the procurement advice. So there's two contracts, two contract values, and therefore two series of payments, which I think for us, yes, they might be separate, but they're also related. So I think one needs to add them both up, not just one of them.
Okay. Is there any instances where the department's engaging probity advice from the same place as the procurement advice currently? And is Asterix still contracted to the department?
Under an existing contract, yes.
Under the existing contract, while the NAP 10 contract negotiations have been continuing.
And this is just because we're on a roll here and this might be a fun last question, is that there's no identified potential conflicts of interest with Asterix in any other parts of the department or any of the decision-making involved in this?
Not that I'm aware of.
Likewise.
Okay. Well, it is a Friday. We've had a long sitting week and we've got another one next week, so we might wrap it up there. But thank you very much to the Attorney General's Department for being here today and for fronting up to the questions. I know it's been a sort of robust and honest discussion, but given these matters and given the seriousness of all involved, I appreciate that, and I appreciate the the engagement with the committee. If you've been asked to take questions on notice or provide additional information, can you please forward the responses to the Secretariat by Friday, 14 November. If the committee has further questions, they'll be sent to you in writing through the Secretariat. And I'm going to now close the hearing and the meeting. And I thank all members and witnesses for their attendance today. Thank you, broadcasters. Thank you, Committee Secretariat. And thank you to the Audit Office as well. Thanks all. Have a good weekend.
Thanks, everyone.